The invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022 escalated a conflict that began with Putin's annexation of Crimea in 2014, transforming it into a full-blown war marked by substantial losses on both sides. The question of how many soldiers Russia has lost looms large. While Putin may present figures suggesting minimal losses, evidence from Ukraine and Western media paints a starkly different picture of Russian casualties. Yet the toll of this conflict extends beyond the battlefield casualties. Significant damage to equipment, weapons, and lost territories underscores the war's broader impact. What do these losses indicate about the current state of Putin's war in Ukraine and its possible future trajectory? Let's dive in. From the outset, Putin believed it would be a relatively short war, lasting a few weeks and with minimal casualties. What followed were months of fierce attritional fighting, with both sides and independent reports claiming higher and higher casualties. With the severe underestimation of the duration and extent of the war, it was likely that Putin believed that Russian casualties wouldn't reach more than a few hundred or a few thousand. But then the true figures started rolling in. With a large chunk of the world focused on the ongoing conflict, at least until Israel declared war on Hamas, it's understandable that both Russia and Ukraine would want to twist the narrative in their favor. Indeed, one of the first reports from Russia in June 2022 spoke of only 5,900 deaths in the Russian armed forces. On the other hand, reports from the US and UK suggested that the actual figure was closer to 15,000. Ukrainian reports went further still, stating that as many as 30,000 Russian soldiers had been killed in the first few months of the war. So which figure is correct? There's no way to know for certain, but a study published in the peer-reviewed scientific journal PNAS suggested that there's a method to how each country displays its losses. On average, Ukraine reports nearly double the number of actual Russian deaths, but doesn't have a bias towards reporting their own deaths. This is possibly in an attempt to gain further support from the countries sympathetic to Ukraine's cause, such as members of the EU and NATO that are supplying Ukraine with military aid. On the other hand, Russia severely underreports deaths of their own soldiers at a rate of roughly 0.3 per one actual death. Any figure from Russia, therefore, should be nearly tripled to get a value that's close to correct. Additionally, the Russian media reports Ukrainian deaths at a ratio of a staggering 4.3 to 1. Meaning that Russians are led to believe that more than 4 times as many Ukrainians have died than have in reality. As a result, getting accurate figures on Russian casualties from either Ukrainian or Russian media can be a serious undertaking, considering the number fudging that the state media outlets do to further their own war agenda. Luckily, that's where unofficial reports from Russian media outlets and military, or reports from independent media, can shed light on the whole truth. One of the most notable reports coming from the Russian side was that of the Wagner Group, a private military group funded by the Russian government. In a May 2023 report that was mostly unauthorized by the state media, the then leader of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, revealed that the Wagner company lost around 22,000 troops and had 40,000 more injured. Based on that report and extrapolating from the size of Wagner compared to the Russian military, reports from the UK and US media suggested that Russia lost around 120,000 soldiers by August 2023, with another 170,000 wounded. This could support the numbers outlined in the PNAS study, which suggested that the actual deaths of Russians by February 2023 were around 77,000. As such, estimates by the UK and US media were on the right track, though the actual numbers are much more difficult to confirm. That's where BBC Russia and Mediazona, an independent news outlet, joined forces to investigate wartime deaths thoroughly. Unlike traditional reports based solely on field reports and those from the militaries, the BBC delved deeper and tried to individually document every death on either side of the conflict. This was done through not only reports, but required actual military records, the circumstances that led to the death, and reports from the person's local area, all of which would likely be more nuanced and detailed. In many cases, reporters went all over the country to extract information about the recently deceased from graveyards, parades, and war memorials, scouring for new names and graves. The investigators also searched for posts on social media from the deceased relatives and friends or obituaries published in local newspapers. The essence of the detailed search was that each death had to have a name attached. No longer were the numbers just figures that would pop into someone's head only to be forgotten a few seconds later. They were now real people who had died for their country, no matter how flawed the cause. This stringent set of criteria led to many of the deaths being overlooked due to the investigators' inability to confirm whether what was in the report, from either Russian or Ukrainian outlets, was actually true. However, with the BBC's backing of the data, the BBC Russia Media Zona report is considered the closest to the actual count of Russian soldier deaths, if not going under the real figure due to the aforementioned difficulties in obtaining the correct figures. If someone's name was on the list, then that means the person most likely existed and died during the Russo-Ukrainian War. The figures reported in October 2023 by BBC Russia suggested that Russia had lost around 88,000 soldiers 20 months into the war. BBC Russia didn't provide an estimate of the injured in that period, but the US news outlets reported around 170,000 injuries around August 2023, which was the most realistic estimate at the time. Better yet, the report was so detailed that the outlets could track down the deceased soldiers to the exact unit they served in. This served to create a detailed analysis of Russia's wartime efforts, as well as the average number of soldiers present in the Russian military. The reports from the earlier months of the war roughly correlated with what you'd expect most common deaths to be: younger soldiers on the front lines, with the average being a 21-year-old male professional soldier. However, the figures from the later months in the report suggested that there was an increasing number of former prison inmates in the Wagner Group and pilots dying than usual. This is important for two reasons. First, it showcased that the Russian military, despite a widespread effort to conscript more soldiers, was bolstered by those most likely unwilling to actually fight for the country and were coerced into stepping onto the front lines. Inmates accounted for roughly 18.6% of all deaths recorded by BBC and Media Zona. This highlights the extent of desperation present in the Wagner Group to bolster its trained military with people considered expendable meat shields for the more vital soldiers in the units. Second, the deaths of pilots meant that Russia was being drained of highly specialized military troops that it couldn't train in time to replace the deceased. In some estimates, it takes roughly $3 million and multiple years to make a pilot combat ready. This means that each pilot taken down by Ukrainian forces results in the grounding of a part of Russia's Air Force. Another independent outlet, Medusa, worked alongside the previously mentioned Media Zone to conduct its own study on the Russian casualties during the war. Unlike the investigation done by the BBC, Medusa relied on information from the Russian probate registries, which are used when real estate or cars are inherited when their original owner dies. By going through the number of open cases that use the probate registry, Medusa could approximate the excess mortality in the Russian population. This methodology is akin to the estimates used during the COVID-19 pandemic, where Russia obfuscated the number of deaths in the country for similar reasons. Since the pandemic wasn't over in 2021, Medusa had to fall back down to data prior to 2020. The news website published its full methodology alongside the sources the outlet used to make their claims. According to its study, Medusa reported that Russia had 25,000 excess deaths by the end of 2022, which was likely most, if not all, from the Russo-Ukrainian War. Similarly, the outlet suggested around 47,000 excess deaths by May 2023, just 5 months after the first report, showcasing that the deaths sharply increased in 2023. If we take these figures to be true, then the estimate by the BBC of 88,000 deaths in October is probably as close to reality as we can get. But those are figures from mid to late 2023, and the war is still going. What are the most recently updated figures? According to the latest data presented by BBC Russia, the total Russian death toll could be as high as 107,000 as of February 2024, and that's not all. When compounded with the estimates of severe injuries that cause soldiers to be discharged from the service, the total losses of the Russian army could amount to as many as 321,000. This figure closely aligns with the numbers published by the US news outlets, suggesting around 315,000 losses. This accounts for more than 85% of the troops in Russia's pre-invasion available forces, which were around 360,000. Of the estimated 107,000 casualties over the course of 24 months, the war resulted in 53,500 casualties on the Russian side alone. Compare that to the other notable wars, and the figure is higher than the war in Iraq, 2013-17, 50,095 deaths per year, and the Syrian civil war, 2011 to present, 43,736 deaths per year. When combined with the losses suffered by Ukraine, the death toll is a staggering 95,000 per year. This makes the Russo-Ukrainian War the deadliest conflict in the 21st century, beating out the Tigray War in Ethiopia. But the number of human casualties paints only part of the picture of the true losses suffered by Russia as a result of invading Ukraine. Also devastating have been the other military losses during the war, that of equipment and infrastructure. According to a February 2023 report, Russia lost roughly half of its battle-ready tanks a year into the war, crippling its ability to mount a unified offensive. This partly led to the drawn-out conflicts going on today. Yet another report in April 2023 suggested that Russia has lost over 10,000 pieces of vital military equipment, including tanks, trucks, artillery, and drones. In some cases, the losses were so severe that the Russian military was forced to redeploy some Soviet and Cold War-era tanks, which were veritable museum pieces in 2022. This is a huge downgrade in Russian military capacity. While the T-54s were among the peak tanks in the 20th century, their usefulness sharply dropped with new anti-tank weapons being developed in the late 80s and 90s. Today, a T-54 is no match for the most devastating weapons fielded by Ukraine that the UK, France, and the US have been steadily providing to the front lines. Furthermore, the T-54's 100mm guns struggle to penetrate modern armor, making them relatively useless in tank-to-tank warfare. Considering that is a relatively rare occurrence, the T-54 still poses some threat to infantry and light, unarmored tanks and vehicles such as the Soviet-era Grad launcher both sides are still using to this day. Comparatively, Ukraine has reintroduced most of its old weaponry, such as the T-55, but its fleet was upgraded with modern 105mm L7 guns capable of piercing through contemporary armor. Ukrainian tanks have also upgraded engines and tactical equipment, putting Russia woefully behind in technology on the front lines. According to some reports, Russia is even holding back its tanks for later use and trying to stockpile as many tanks as possible. This includes the newly built T-90s and the older T-62, T-72, and T-80s that Russia has pulled out of cold storage. As a result, most of the forces currently fighting on the front lines are purely infantry, and Russia is accruing more losses by the day. This could point to Russia trying to accumulate enough tanks for a final push in the future, and is using its infantry as cannon fodder to try and lower Ukraine's defenses as much as possible before that happens. While this might sound like a dubious plan by Russia's military command, the fact is that Russia has roughly 4 times the population of Ukraine. While of course not everyone can be conscripted, the attritional nature of the war could lead to Russia gaining some ground in the long term, since it can absorb heavier losses and regroup its efforts later. However, this has led to multiple waves of conscription efforts in the country, usually focused on lower density regions. This is partially due to the comparatively lower salaries outside of the major cities, usually around $500 per month compared to $1,200 in Moscow. Additionally, a military contract provides up to $2,500 per month, making it lucrative to lower-earning people in remote provinces. As a result, other reports from Medusa suggest that people in far-off provinces are much more likely to be the casualties of the Russo-Ukrainian war. The outlet states that for every Muscovite that dies in the war, 275 people in Buryatia and 350 people in Tuva die, which are some of the poorest regions predominantly inhabited by various minorities. It's not just the poor that have suffered over the course of the war. The conscription efforts have shaken the country to its core, resulting in waves of people emigrating from Russia to avoid being conscripted. If that wasn't the primary reason, then many more have suffered from Russia's attempts to subvert the public on how the war is actually going. In some extreme cases, the authorities have forbidden people from creating memorials for the fallen ones or spreading information about Russia's war efforts. According to some estimates, more than 900,000 Russians have left the country since the invasion. These are mostly people with the means to book prohibitively expensive flights or find other methods to legally escape the country. As such, they are primarily middle-class citizens, usually in IT and service sectors that brought significant income to the country via taxes. This is a huge blow to Russia's economy, but it's not the only one. Due to Russia's plentiful supply of oil and natural gas and the EU's previous lack of those resources, the country could command high prices on the market and invest significant funds into building a pipeline infrastructure. However, due to the invasion and most of Europe siding with Ukraine, that trade has trickled to a portion of what it used to be and has stopped altogether in some cases. This led to Russia needing to find an alternative source of funding to power its war machine. That's where China entered the picture. As a resource-demanding country with pretty much no access to oil and gas, as well as precious building materials and minerals internally, China has previously used overseas oil importers from the Persian Gulf. Recent geopolitical influence from the US in the area made China hesitant to fully rely on the Gulf as its sole source of oil and gas. For that reason, they had to diversify. Former Soviet countries such as Tajikistan account for a noticeable fraction of China's oil imports, but the country saw an opportunity in the new conflict between the Russians and Ukrainians. China positioned itself as one of Russia's biggest allies throughout the war, at least on the surface. It has not condemned any of Russia's military operations inside Ukraine and has consistently abstained in negotiations and discussions in the UN regarding Russia. Additionally, China has negotiated a significant trade deal with Russia for its oil, gas, and resources from the Siberian Far East. Faced with losing a bulk of its export funding from the West, Russia was forced to accept exporting oil and gas to China at prices roughly half of those the resources had with its Western partners. Despite that, the Russian economy is still going relatively strong, even if it's becoming obvious that a bulk of it is solely oriented toward its war efforts. But it's still suffering from the inability to trade properly with other countries and extreme losses in manpower and equipment that requires a lot of funding to replace. As a result, Russia's central bank reported in 2023 that the country's inflation rate is roughly 11.1%. However, the actual prices paint a much grimmer picture of Russia's economy. Some economists suggest that the actual inflation rate in Russia is closer to 60%, with food prices spiking up to 75% compared to the figures from 2022. If this continues, Russia could end up with a runaway inflation problem that threatens the entire country's economy with collapse. This is bolstered by the fact that interest rates in Russia's banks have soared to 15%. The interest hike is not the first in the history of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Shortly after the invasion, banks set the interest rate to 20% but lowered them to normal levels shortly afterward. However, it looks like the current economic situation is dire enough that the interest rates will stay as is. It's forced many residents to move their disposable income into savings accounts, with estimates putting the deposit rates at 32%, much higher than those in the Western world, such as in the UK with only 9%. The increased savings deposit can lead to a domino effect. With a significant chunk of money locked away in savings accounts, the Russian economy, or more accurately its citizens, won't have enough disposable capital to maintain itself. Regardless, the Russian media consistently reports that the country's economy is doing well, and the rest of the world begrudgingly agrees. The IMF reported that Russia's economy grew faster than any country currently on the G7 list: France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Japan, the UK, and the US. This paints a bleak picture and suggests that the war might extend for a couple more years. But is this growth actually sustainable by any standards? The short answer is no. While Russia's economy is arguably doing well enough to support its war efforts, all measures taken by Russia's government are ultimately patchwork solutions that will create an unbalanced, highly centralized economy focused on the big Russian cities. Additionally, if the conscription efforts continue, there's probably going to be a lack of available recruits from Russia's poorer areas. This will mean that Russia will finally have to aggressively recruit from Moscow and other big cities. These are the same places that are powering Russia's propaganda machine. Currently, Muscovites don't feel the effect of the war on their daily life, apart from slightly increased prices in the country's capital. Their standard of living hasn't been affected yet. But if Russia is required to pull their recruits from the same people that are propping up the Russian economy and are completely oblivious to the real state of the country, the wall of illusion will break rapidly. With that comes the potential acknowledgement that Russia has lost more than just soldiers. The economy is being supported artificially. China has basically made Russia accept any and all terms in order to have their plentiful oil and gas exported at any price. The rest of Europe has seen that Putin's regime is no longer as ironclad as it used to be and is heavily dependent on the core of Russia being none the wiser about the reality of the war and fate of the country. If that happens, the consequences for Russia could be catastrophic. The current prognosis on the war is that Russia can't make a meaningful push into Ukraine in 2024 due to consistent setbacks in obtaining the right equipment, most of which is being imported from China. That means that Russia is facing another year of uncertainty where it must push more people into the war's meat grinder to maintain a semblance of superiority over Ukraine, at least in the eyes of its most devoted populace. As such, the future is uncertain. China's moves in recent years suggest that it might consider attacking Russia for the precious resources and drinking water of Siberia. However, it's more likely that China will keep up with an endless stream of demands to either prolong the war or enforce its own peace terms on both countries to get the best deal. Regardless, it's most likely that Russia will become nothing more than a Chinese puppet, either exporting most of its resources to China in return for complete influence, both technologically and politically. Alternatively, China will actually invade Russia and take the country's resources for itself. In either case, Russia will likely cease being a meaningful player on the world stage and be forced to pander to Chinese whims. Of course, even these scenarios aren't certain. With the US hinting that China is not a severe threat to the world, It's likely that the US military has already poised itself to take advantage of any moves China makes and retaliate appropriately. But how? By cutting off the country's resource supplies to the south before it can recuperate from preying on Russia. That puts everyone in a state of stalemate. In any case, Russia has lost more than 1 million people overall, whether due to death, injuries, or widespread immigration, and its economy stands to lose even more. The fate of the country rests with Putin's current regime and whether it can gain a meaningful victory over Ukraine and enforce peace terms that enable the economy to bounce back. Otherwise, Russia may collapse in the same way the Soviet Union collapsed 3 decades before. But what do you think is going to happen with Russia? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching the video. Now, go and check out why Russia's military arsenal is low, weak, and outdated. Or click this other video instead. For more than a decade, Ukrainian troops held strong in Avdiivka. But by the time the demolished city fell into the hands of the Russians, only a few of the city's 30,000 pre-war inhabitants were left. Ukraine's 110th Mechanized Brigade, which had been stationed in Avdiivka since the war began, held the line as long as they could. But when the last of the 110th withdrew from the city, the fears of Ukrainian leaders, as well as many experts, were realized. Will Ukraine lose their ability to put pressure on Russian supply lines passing through Donetsk? Many have been asking, could this be the turning point in the increasingly costly war that we've all been dreading? For 4 straight months, as the violence in Avdiivka reached its apex, the troops of the 110th demonstrated remarkable resilience, fending off a seemingly inexhaustible enemy. With the help of the Ukrainian Army's 47th and 53rd Brigades, who'd been guarding their flank with drones, mines, artillery, and even a few American-made M2 fighting vehicles, the 110th inflicted tens of thousands of casualties on a Russian force that was once 40,000 strong. Even when Russia's casualties were reportedly outnumbering Ukraine's by 7, even 10 to 1, Putin never let up. After months of what resembled trench warfare more than urban combat, Avdiivka was ultimately transformed into a ghost town, with its few remaining residents, perhaps 1,000 people, mostly living below ground, relying solely on humanitarian aid for survival. Through the winter, attacks of the energy infrastructure also left Avdiivka entirely without power. And yet, despite the relentless shelling and harsh conditions, some residents remained resilient, having adapted after nearly 10 years of living on the front lines to a much harsher life. But in the end, as the last of the 110th began falling back to the west of the city, they were forced to round up all remaining residents. Given the importance of Avdiivka, not just for its strategic military value, but also its propaganda power, this loss was not just a heavy blow to Ukrainian morale, but will also likely allow Putin to present his claim to the ruined city as a symbolic victory, helping him further justify his re-election. Throughout this war, but certainly in Avdiivka, we've seen an odd mix of modern warfighting capabilities: drones, modern battle tanks, precision-guided missiles, etc., and knockdown, drag-out battles for terrain that are reminiscent of World War I, where 100 meters, 1,000 meters are gained here and lost there, while an outrageous number of casualties pile up on the battlefield. We've seen these outdated tactics being used by both sides, but especially by Russia. The truth is, it's been a hard, long winter for both sides. Not long after the fighting in Avdiivka surged, back in November, a fierce storm lashed the Black Sea region, bringing with it widespread damage to southern Russia and Ukraine. Perhaps as an omen of the disastrous events to come, trees were uprooted, power lines were brought down, as coastal areas were thrashed and flooded. In the end, over 500,000 people were left without electricity. Emergency conditions were declared in various parts of the Crimean Peninsula as schools and hospitals shut down, and officials advised residents to stay indoors. In many areas, water and central heating services were disrupted, highways flooded, and low-lying areas had to be evacuated. Even Moscow got heavy snowfall, with drifts reaching as high as 25 centimeters, 3 times the usual amount for that time of the year. The storm was said to be part of a weather system that created blizzard-like conditions in Romania, Moldova, Bulgaria, and Serbia as well, and was declared one of the most intense storms ever recorded. But even as the storm passed, the bloody battle for Avdiivka continued. As one of the most fortified settlements in Ukraine, Avdiivka has been called the gateway to the provincial capital of Donetsk, located only 6 kilometers to the south. But even if Russia controls much of the region, Ukraine's control of Avdiivka has long prevented it from fully utilizing Donetsk as a much-needed communications and transportation hub. Avdiivka also had one of the largest coke plants in Ukraine, the Avdiivka coke and chemical plant, which was crucial to Ukraine's industrial infrastructure, as coke is a key fuel used in making steel and other industrial processes. Before it was destroyed, this plant was not only vital to the war effort, but to Ukraine's economy in general. With everything that's happened recently, it can be easy to forget the contest for Avdiivka has actually been raging since July 2014, when Ukrainian forces recaptured the city from pro-Russian separatists at the very early stages of what would come to be known as the war in Donbass. But the first major battle for control of Avdiivka would be fought a few years later, in late January and early February 2017. Sparked by a dispute over what was known as the Industrial Zone, a buffer zone located in the eastern part of Avdiivka between the newly declared Donetsk People's Republic and the Ukrainian army, a week of savage fighting broke out. Both sides accused the other of initiating the battle. Some reports say that Ukrainian soldiers seized a small stretch of road, which provoked the initial separatist bombardment. During this attack, DPR forces indiscriminately fired artillery shells, mortars, and rockets into mostly residential areas, leaving more than 17,000 people without essential services, prompting the Ukrainian government to declare a state of emergency. More attacks, consisting of both pro-Russian troops and tanks, were then launched on Ukrainian positions, but little progress was made, and soon, with the encouragement of NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, Russia persuaded the separatists to stand down. A ceasefire was called, but both sides had suffered around 25 casualties. 14 civilians were also reportedly killed. What would become the definitive battle for Avdiivka, on the other hand, would be exceedingly longer and more deadly. But should that come as a surprise? Perhaps we should have expected Putin to spend the winter pushing wave after wave of soldiers into the fray. What also might come as a surprise is that this battle actually began the week before Russia officially invaded Ukraine. Back in late February 2022, as Russian troops were massing at several points on the Ukrainian border, Russian attacks on Ukrainian forces near Avdiivka had already intensified, as small groups of separatist militants attempted to penetrate the city. Soon the Avdiivka coke and chemical plant was hit by an artillery shell and would have to suspend operations. The damaged plant would remain a target for Russian artillery, however, until February 2024, when it was largely destroyed, before being fully captured by Russian forces. Nearly 20 months later, on October 10, 2023, the final assault on Avdiivka would begin. Since Ukraine launched its failed counteroffensive back in June, Russia has attempted very few larger assaults. Leading up to October, we've seen a relatively predictable pattern emerge. Given that neither side has had the capacity to launch the sort of massive attack that would result in large gains on the battlefield, we've mostly seen smaller units pushing ahead as far as they can, typically with a lot of artillery and drone support. After more than a year and a half of intermittent fighting, though, Russia finally launched its first full-scale offensive aimed at encircling and capturing Avdiivka. And it worked, even though they suffered huge losses on the battlefield. In the first few days of their offensive, Russian forces were able to capture roughly 4.5 square kilometers of territory around the besieged city. Then, after thousands of Russian soldiers had been ravaged by artillery fire, Ukrainian troops noticed a change in their tactics. They began to divide up into smaller and smaller formations, making each unit a somewhat less obvious target for Ukrainian shells. While at the same time, Russian airstrikes hammered at the city's defenses, Ukraine's outnumbered forces also took a beating from Russia's artillery, as well as hundreds of gliding bombs. To accomplish his goal, though, and take the city, it was clear Putin would be more than willing to take heavy losses, in terms of both troops and equipment. Estimates vary, but the consensus of military analysts, pro-Russian bloggers, and Ukrainian officials seems to be that Russia lost more troops taking Avdiivka than it did during 10 years of fighting in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Exact numbers are nearly impossible to verify, as they're commonly inflated by the side inflicting the casualties and downplayed by the side suffering them, which leaves the true number unknown. But Russian casualties in Avdiivka are believed to be higher than the official number of Soviet dead in Afghanistan, which would put the total over 15,000, with at least another 30,000 injured. An unconfirmed source from the Ukrainian military command claimed that, at last count, in the region of Avdiivka, between January 1st and February 15th, their inflicted casualties mounted to 20,018 personnel, 199 tanks, and 481 combat vehicles. That's a lot of carnage for only 6 weeks of fighting. But this shouldn't be all that shocking. The Kremlin has always downplayed its willingness to carelessly sacrifice men and equipment. To try and overwhelm Ukrainian positions so that other troops can then progress forward, Russian military leaders have been known to deploy wave after wave of often poorly trained and unsupported soldiers. The use of outdated, careless tactics like these left the battlefield in Avdiivka and elsewhere littered with frozen Russian bodies. These largely suicidal attacks have been so widely reported, in fact, that they were given the gruesome nickname Meatwave Assaults. Totally unconcerned with troop losses, Putin was able to make slow progress in Avdiivka and eventually force Ukraine to retreat. But Ukraine has suffered its fair share of casualties too, and not just during those final days in Avdiivka. President Zelensky has claimed that some 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died in this war so far, but most Western analysts say the number is significantly higher. Especially when it comes to key territory in the Donbas region, which has been mostly occupied by Russian proxies since 2014, both sides are going to fight it out to the bitter end. But Putin appears to be willing to pay almost any cost to accomplish his goals. Some military analysts have said that gaining full control of the Donbas would be enough for the Kremlin to publicly consider the invasion of Ukraine a victory, which could explain Moscow's willingness to trade as many lives as necessary to capture it. And perhaps the main reason Ukraine lost control is that its military leaders weren't willing to make the same sacrifices as Putin. Take, for example, the decision of newly appointed Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky, who on February 17th called for the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces just as the last Ukrainian supply routes into Avdiivka had come under serious threat. Leading up to this point, to soften Ukraine's defenses, Russian forces had been using roughly the same approach that had eventually worked for them in 2022 when they captured the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which was to basically obliterate anything larger than a mailbox. Which meant that after months of constant shelling and airstrikes, Ukrainian forces were left with little to no cover. So to avoid being surrounded in the open and hopefully preserve the lives of his men, Syrsky ordered them to abandon the city and establish new defensive positions on higher ground to the west and southwest. Pulling out of Avdiivka was the right decision, Zelensky told the Munich Security Conference immediately following the retreat. Russia had nearly surrounded Avdiivka, and the total losses of the 110th would have been catastrophic for Ukraine's fighting capacity. Besides, a tactical retreat doesn't necessarily lead to a wider strategic loss, for with the right weapons and adequate ammunition, the Ukrainians could still be able to disrupt Russian supply lines going through Donetsk. We need to keep in mind too that it took Russia months to capture just 30 square kilometers in and around Avdiivka, and for now Ukraine still has a solid foothold in the Donetsk region. So it's still unclear whether Russian troops will immediately be able to put Ukraine's new defensive line to the test. But if the Russians do continue to put pressure on Ukraine, despite their losses in Avdiivka, along with more troops and a boost in morale, the Ukrainians will likely need the United States to start coughing up some ammunition if they hope to fend off another full-scale attack. Otherwise, Putin might just achieve the victory he's been prophesizing, but only if he has enough troops left in reserve to hold his hard-won territory. Because at this point, it's still unclear whether or not the Russian military has the manpower to exploit the situation created by Ukraine's retreat from Avdiivka. From here, Russia will also likely be attacking a series of well-entrenched positions, a course of action that puts the assaulting force at a far greater risk of sustaining casualties. Advancing troops are often dangerously exposed, compared to those fighting from a trench, and recovering wounded or dead soldiers from the battlefield becomes a highly dangerous challenge. But if Ukraine doesn't receive some much-needed American aid soon, most military analysts say they're not optimistic about Zelensky's chances for success in 2024. As the war enters its third year, both sides are struggling to find enough men to continue fighting with the same level of intensity. Russia, however, has a population 3 times that of Ukraine, about 144 million, which gives it a significant advantage in a war of attrition. This strategy will only work, however, if Putin is able to mobilize more and more soldiers. When the war began, hundreds of thousands of men fled the country. Then in September 2022, the Kremlin decided to call up some 300,000 conscripts, the first draft of its kind since World War II, which not only rattled the nation, but damaged Putin's carefully constructed image of normalcy. Since then, the Russian government has tried to put off another round of mobilization for as long as possible, boosting financial and legal incentives instead, hoping to attract convicts, debtors, migrants, and members of other vulnerable social groups to volunteer for duty on the front lines. Russia has also begun to strictly enforce the country's previously lax policy regarding mandatory military service for young men. For different reasons, a shortage of troops has become a grave concern for both sides, meaning that the losses suffered during the battle for Avdiivka were duly felt. For neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians wanted nor could afford a repeat of what happened in Bakhmut. The battle for Bakhmut, a city located on the Bakhmutka River, about 90 kilometers north of Donetsk, kicked off in early August 2022, after Russian forces advanced from the city of Popasna, following a Ukrainian withdrawal there. What took place after that has not only been considered the bloodiest and longest battle of the Russo-Ukrainian War, it's also been called one of the bloodiest infantry-on-infantry brawls since World War II. The main assault force consisted primarily of pro-Russian mercenaries from the controversial paramilitary organization known as PMC Wagner, or the Wagner Group, who were supported by some regular Russian troops and elements from the DPR. By November, attacks on the city had intensified, as Wagner fighters were reinforced by units coming from the Kherson front and newly mobilized recruits. By this time, too, much of the front line had descended into staggering trench warfare, with both sides paying a huge price for every meter gained. Only by sending waves of former convicts straight into the Ukrainian lines was Putin able to gradually end the stalemate, and by February 2023, Russian forces had captured key territory in both the north and south of Bakhmut, nearly encircling the city. Ukraine's forces had no choice but to slowly withdraw, which resulted in weeks of fierce urban combat. A month later, Russian forces had captured the eastern half of the city up to the Bakhmutka River and were continuing their advance into other Ukrainian-controlled areas. And by the end of May, the Kremlin was claiming they'd taken full control of the now pulverized city. After 8 months of heavy fighting in a city with a pre-war population of approximately 72,000, only 4,000 residents remained, mostly living in underground shelters with no access to water, gas, or electricity. Once a popular tourist destination known for its sparkling wine produced in underground caves, its broad tree-lined avenues, lush parks, and late 19th century mansions, Bakhmut was reduced to a smoldering wasteland. Even as he denied Putin's assertion that he'd captured the city, Zelensky compared the visible devastation of Bakhmut to Hiroshima after it was hit by the atomic bomb. Despite the fierce struggle to control it, initially Bakhmut was not regarded as a target of great tactical importance, but it would ultimately become one of the central battles of the Russo-Ukrainian War so far. Similarly to what occurred later in Avdiivka, as the battle raged on, the city itself gained a level of symbolic importance for both sides, largely because of the heavy investment of manpower and resources it was taking to claim it. For both the Ukrainian and Russian militaries, the Battle of Bakhmut has been described as a meat grinder, some of the fiercest urban combat in Europe since World War II. The intensity of the fighting and number of casualties has even led some experts to compare Bakhmut to the Battle of Verdun during World War I, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing during the nearly year-long struggle between the dwindling armies of France and Germany. In the end, the best Ukraine could hope for in Bakhmut was to keep the Russians bogged down along this small but tactically significant 1,500-kilometer stretch of front line as they depleted both their resources and morale. But as their own ammunition supplies ran low, Ukrainian forces lost their strategic edge, and the Russians were able to seize Ukraine's flank. Supply lines were disrupted and casualties surged. In the last days before Russia announced its possession of the city, Ukrainian fighting positions had been whittled down to just a handful of crumbling buildings. Outnumbered and outgunned, pinned down by constant Russian bombardments, the Ukrainians continued to be hit by waves of mercenaries. When their defensive positions finally gave way, however, and a tactical retreat was ordered, it was too late. The delayed retreat would ultimately compromise Ukraine's advantage and result in scores of unnecessary casualties. These heavy losses would damage the reputation of certain generals, who were harshly compared to Russian leaders known to be careless with the lives of their troops. This misstep would also eat away at the Ukrainian public's trust, dampening their already waning enthusiasm for voluntary military service. Still, Ukraine's losses were a fraction of Russia's. According to the head of PMC Wagner and other sources, the mercenary group lost over 20,000 soldiers over the course of the nearly year-long battle, while another 60,000 were injured. But other experts believe these estimates are probably low, by a few thousand at least. What's completely clear to everyone is that in Bakhmut, and more recently in Avdiivka, even though the capture of the city could be considered a major victory for Russia, it came at a tremendous human cost. A cost even the most reckless leaders would be hesitant to pay, but then again, Putin isn't most leaders. Knowing that if he loses the war in Ukraine, it will likely be the end of him, a former Russian diplomat, Boris Bondarev, has said that Putin would be willing to sacrifice 10 to 20 million Russian soldiers to win. Initially, Putin had planned for this war to be very short, 1 or 2 weeks, but now he must win at all costs. Way back in February 2022, when Russia moved missile launchers, combat aircraft, and nearly 200,000 troops up to the Ukrainian border, many feared the worst. But a quick Russian victory never came. Instead, the Russian military has continued to sustain staggering losses. At this point, it's believed that well over 100,000 soldiers have been killed. According to the Ukrainian military, that number could be closer to 300,000. Thousands of pieces of armored equipment and several squadrons of fighter jets and helicopters have also been lost. It didn't take long for a well-planned strategy to give way to brute force and repetitive attacks as Russia's military became unrecognizable from what it was at the start of the conflict. Since then, Russia has had to rely on massive involuntary troop augmentations, and to replace equipment, they've been tapping into older and older stocks. Even as the Kremlin has upped the nation's defense budget and tried to accelerate production of defense equipment, the Russian military has continued to take a beating. And yet, Putin hasn't let up, clearly choosing an offensive approach as he continues to swap out apprehensive generals for more obedient ones. As we saw in both Avdiivka and Bakhmut, the Russian command has maintained a high tolerance for losses and has no problem sending unprepared troops onto the battlefield. At some point, the Russian military may not be able to compensate for its lack of trained soldiers, non-commissioned officers, junior officers, and various specialists who have been lost. But Putin shows no signs of abandoning his current strategy. He seems willing to sacrifice the lives of as many Russians as it will take to secure his own future. With that said, not every Russian soldier who's been killed in Ukraine was sent to their death by Putin. Putin does in fact command a loyal following among certain segments of the Russian population, especially in the more rural areas outside of Moscow, although it's highly likely that many of his supporters have been highly influenced by Russian propaganda, which enthusiastically portrays Russia and its peoples as victims of Ukrainian and Western aggression. For most Russians, though, military service feels more like an obligation than a choice, and there are harsh penalties for anyone who gets called up to serve but fails to report for duty, which is why many have chosen the uncertainties of war over the guarantee of harsh imprisonment. During its long history of authoritarian rule, Russia developed a broader political culture where blind obedience to the state largely became the norm. But the history of Russia during times of war goes against this subservient narrative. During World War I, for example, huge numbers of Russian soldiers deserted the trenches and returned home to participate in the emerging revolution. In World War II as well, battalions of soldiers surrendered to the Germans or joined the Russian Liberation Army and began fighting for the other side. So what might encourage Russian troops to take similar action now? Actions that might just save their lives in this war? There are several factors that might just provoke a shift in the mindset of an already weary Russian soldier, most of which have already happened or are imminent. These include heavy battlefield losses, dim prospects for victory, and ongoing mass mobilization efforts. Perhaps the thing that might end this slaughter for good, though, is Putin falling gravely ill, dying, or being removed from power. And it's not unrealistic to think that getting rid of Putin might be the only way this war comes to an end anytime soon, because the Russian president has shown no indication that he plans to change tactics or step down. According to Dr. Ken DeClaver, an American psychiatrist who spent over 25 years analyzing antagonistic foreign leaders, the key to understanding Putin's motivations, actions, and decision-making process are the 3 R's: resilience, ruthlessness, and rationality. Putin would not have risen to the heights he has without resilience and ruthlessness. But when it comes to rationality, DeClaver does not mean the dictator possesses sound reasoning, but that his actions are rational according to his individual perspective. Tragically, Putin seems to view the invasion of Ukraine as a rational act. How else could he willingly bomb maternity clinics, schools, civilian centers, and energy infrastructure? Heinous acts that, according to the 1948 Genocide Convention, could easily be considered war crimes. Putin's pattern of rationalizing irrationality extends beyond the current conflict in Ukraine to previous actions such as the events in Chechnya in the early 2000s, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and the involvement of the Russian forces in Syria, most notably in Aleppo, starting in the 2010s. When looking at Putin, DeClaver also highlights the concept of revengeism, which can be observed in his obvious desire to redraw Russia's borders to their pre-1991 arrangement. And it's this mentality that's led to the disruption of a post-World War II order that's been instrumental in maintaining peace in Europe for over 70 years. But what can be done with a leader who doesn't care that the international community despises him? The old Putin before 2022, and perhaps as far back as 2018, might have cared to some extent that most everyone thinks he's a monster. The one who embarked on a diplomacy tour throughout Europe following the attempted assassination of former Russian military intelligence officer Sergei Skripal. At one point, Putin did appear to be concerned with rehabilitating his diplomatic image, but as the war in Ukraine passes its 2-year mark, he doesn't seem to care all that much. And as his inner circle continues to shrink, his indifference regarding public opinion has too. Now he only seems to care about achieving his goals, regardless of what the rest of the world thinks, including his allies. In the wake of the shocking events on October 7th, Hamas's savage attack on Israel, followed by Israel's violent campaign to oust Hamas from Gaza, much of the world turned their attention away from Russia and Ukraine. But this conflict is far from over. We must keep track of what's happening on the front lines over there, for letting this historic war slip from the global consciousness would be a big mistake. The outcome of this conflict will undoubtedly have serious long-term consequences that extend far beyond Eastern Europe, as long as Putin remains in charge. Of that, you can be certain. In a recent interview with former Fox News host Tucker Carlson, Putin claimed that prior to the invasion, Russia and Ukraine had nearly reached an agreement, but at the last minute Ukraine backed out, choosing instead to obey the instructions of certain European countries and the United States, opting to fight Russia to the bitter end. For this setback, Putin especially blamed former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was himself forced out of the UK Parliament in June 2023, claiming that Johnson personally dissuaded Zelensky from signing a truce early on in the conflict. Putin didn't have anything good to say about President Joe Biden either, claiming that the last time they spoke, which was apparently before Russia invaded Ukraine, he told him he was making a mistake of historic proportions by pushing Russia away and supporting Ukraine. Carlson's reasons for setting up the interview were fairly obvious: entertain his right-wing audience and provoke his enemies on the left. And although he was warned that Putin might use him as a propaganda tool, which is essentially what happened, he went ahead and traveled to Moscow anyway. Putin's reasons for agreeing to be interviewed by the former Fox News presenter are more complicated. One was probably to influence the current narrative surrounding the war in Ukraine, and the other was likely to reassert his historical grievances regarding US foreign policy. Putin has never been shy about his feelings, about accusing Washington of self-harm, of being unable to think in strategic terms, and of failing to understand his own interests. He claimed repeatedly that the US intends to spark new wars and disrupt the world order. But maybe the interview with Tucker Carlson was his attempt to re-establish a dialogue with the US, not with the US political mainstream, of course, but perhaps with highly visible conservatives like Carlson, former President Donald Trump, and billionaire Elon Musk. In Putin's mind, these people could become powerful allies in the future. He seems to be thinking more long-term than the upcoming US presidential election. For the most part, the Russian leader sees the US as its own worst enemy, a system that's doomed to collapse. Sure, he sees a second Trump presidency as a good way to weaken the West and deprive Ukraine of support, but who's occupying the White House is a secondary issue. What he actually wants is for the US to become a country that he can either fool completely or bend to his will. During the interview, after giving Carlson a lengthy and controversial history lesson, Putin was often vague and stubborn, remaining heavily focused on issues that he felt strongly about, instead of directly answering the questions being asked. Despite Carlson's intentions, this only made it more clear just how ideologically misaligned Russia and the West actually are, given it was nearly impossible to establish a coherent dialogue, even between Putin on his best behavior and one of the most irrationally conservative men in America. But what do you think? In war, do the ends always justify the means? What number of casualties is acceptable if the broader strategic goal gets achieved? What makes Putin so willing to sacrifice the lives of his own troops? Will his disregard for his own soldiers be the reason he loses the war in Ukraine, or the reason he wins it? Let us know in the comments. Now go and check out how Putin is failing to defend Crimea, or click this other video instead. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Western observers were wary of its tank force. Russia had the largest tank fleet in the world with 12,556 units. This number was more than its closest rivals North Korea and the United States combined. Meanwhile, Russia's rival Ukraine had only about 1,900 tanks before the war began. The numbers looked hopelessly bad for the Ukrainians. However, numbers aren't everything, and the war in Ukraine proved it. In this video, we'll look at how Russia has lost thousands of tanks in its special military operation, how it deceived the world with its number of tanks, and how its tank failures have been systematic in everything from doctrine to design. Russia started the war with disadvantages. Despite its formidable tank fleet on paper, only about 2,600 of Russia's armored units were main battle tanks, defined as a heavily armored tank that is designed to provide direct firepower in head-on combat. For example, the M1 Abrams and its derivatives fit this role for the United States. Other armored vehicles like the M2 Bradley play important parts on the battlefield, but they are not designed to get into direct combat with enemy tanks or heavily fortified positions, so they are not called main battle tanks. To make matters worse for Russia, only about a quarter of its pre-war main battle tanks had modern sighting and fire control systems. These were the T-72B3 B3M, the T-80 BVM, and the T-90 AM. Worse still, by November 2022, Colin Kahl, the United States Undersecretary for Defense Policy, estimated that Russia had lost half of its pre-war main battle tanks in Ukraine. A year later, the Oryx blog estimates that Russia has lost a total of 2,478 tanks, with 1,621 destroyed, 139 damaged, 170 abandoned, and 548 captured. As a percentage, about 65% of Russia's total tank losses have come through the destruction of its armored units. Ukraine, meanwhile, has lost 689 tanks, with 462 destroyed, 56 damaged, 37 abandoned, and 134 captured. This makes for a Russia to Ukraine casualty ratio of 3.5 to 1. The ratio of tanks lost to destruction between Russia and Ukraine is also 3.5 to 1. However, Ukraine is suffering as well, as 67% of its total tank losses have been through outright destruction rather than damage or abandonment, comparable to the Russian figure. Experts note that Oryx's estimates of the equipment losses on both sides are often a bare minimum, and the real losses are likely higher. Even so, the general picture would remain correct. Even though destruction percentages are similar, Russia is losing tanks at a more rapid rate than Ukraine, and many of the tanks that both sides are using have great flaws. Why have so many tanks on both sides been destroyed, compared to being merely damaged or abandoned? Part of the reason is that Russian tanks are prone to catastrophic damage. Unlike Western tanks like the Abrams, Challenger 2, and Leopard 2, Russian tanks do not compartmentalize their ammunition. Instead, some of the tank's shells are stored in the turret. If the tank gets hit, even indirectly, it can start a chain reaction that results in the entire magazine exploding, creating a jack-in-the-box effect so often seen in Ukraine. Some anti-tank weapons, like the American Javelin, are designed to send their projectiles on an arc that impacts the turret of an enemy tank, which has weaker armor than the body. The result is devastating. Russian tanks suffering from jack-in-the-box explosions did not come as a surprise to Western military experts. They had observed the same effect in the Gulf War, when large numbers of Iraqi T-72 tanks were totaled after their turrets got hit by anti-tank weapons. Russia's other supposedly modern tanks, the T-80 and T-90, have the same design flaw. The T-90 entered service in the Russian military in 1992, but its designers did not learn anything from the Gulf War. As of November 2023, the Oryx blog has estimated that, of visually confirmed cases, Russia has lost 1,270 T-72 type tanks across multiple variants. Of these, 815 have been destroyed, a destruction rate of 64%. Meanwhile, Russia has lost 669 T-80 tanks across multiple variants, with 419 of them being destroyed, making for a destruction rate of 62%. Russia has lost 92 of the different types of T-90. Of these, 55 have been destroyed, a rate of about 60%. Russia has also lost 285 other tanks that Oryx could not identify. Of these, 241 were destroyed, making for a staggering 84.5% destruction rate. While Ukraine has gotten much media attention for its newfound use of Western main battle tanks like the Abrams, Challenger, and Leopard, most of the units in its armored fleet are still Soviet and Russian-designed tanks. Before the conflict, it had about 900 Soviet-made T-64, T-72, and T-80 tanks. Most of these were of the T-64 class. Of these tanks across multiple variants, Ukraine has a total of 376. Of these 376, 241 were destroyed, a rate of 64%. Ukraine has also deployed different tanks of the T-72 class and lost 186 of them, with 132 of them being destroyed, a destruction rate of 71%. 56 Ukrainian T-80s have been lost in combat. 39 of them were destroyed outright, a destruction rate of 69%. In contrast, Ukraine has seen the destruction of just one of the 14 Challenger tanks it's deployed in combat. Meanwhile, of the 25 Leopard tanks that have become casualties in Ukraine, only 9 have seen outright destruction, a rate of 36%. The others were damaged, abandoned, or both. This discrepancy in the destruction rate between Soviet, Russian, and Western tank designs is because the latter's militaries learned from the experience in Iraq. The Abrams, for example, has its ammunition magazine in a sealed compartment. One of the tank's 4 crew members retrieves rounds from this compartment, unsealing and resealing the magazine with each shot. This setup means that if the tank is hit, only one of its rounds is likely to be exposed in the turret. This can damage the tank, but the crew is relatively well protected from enemy fire, and there is far less of a chance of a chain reaction that produces the jack-in-the-box effect. Russia did seem to finally learn the lesson when it designed its latest tank, the T-14 Armata. Unlike the earlier Soviet-produced designs, the T-14 has an armored protected crew capsule, which is completely separate from the ammunition magazine thanks to the tank's auto-loader. Unfortunately for Russia, only about 20 of these units have been produced, far from the 100 that were supposedly in the works with a contract announcement in 2020. Because of international sanctions, logistics, and perennial corruption problems in the Russian military, it's unlikely that Russia will be able to produce many more T-14 tanks anytime soon. Meanwhile, the Armata has never been definitively confirmed as participating in a combat operation in Ukraine. Claims that it has been deployed to the battlefield are likely based on Russian propaganda trying to save face and prevent their country's tank reputation from falling any further. It is likely that the Russian military fears losing the few Armata tanks it's been able to produce. For Russia, the lack of the T-14 Armata also means that it lacks a truly modern main battle tank. Even Russia's supposedly most advanced tank that it can produce in large enough numbers, the T-90, is still based on the T-72, a model which saw its genesis in the late 1960s. Aside from their superior survivability designs, one of the reasons that relatively few of the Western main battle tanks deployed in Ukraine have been destroyed is because their Russian opponents lack the firepower to threaten them. The T-14 Armata was developed with an improved 2A82IM 125mm cannon, which Western military experts conceded was a significant improvement over the guns on the T-72, T-80 and T-90, despite the Armata's other problems. However, this weapon is not backward compatible with Russia's traditional tanks because the breech block does not fit, meaning that the Kremlin cannot deploy it to Ukraine. If the Russians could find a way to field this weapon, the casualty ratio between Ukrainian and Russian tanks might not be so lopsided, but like in many other matters, Russia's poor preparedness for the conflict meant that this problem was overlooked. Additionally, Russia's tank guns have limited mobility. The T-90, for example, can only raise its gun to an arc of 14 degrees or lower it to an arc of 6. In contrast, the Abrams can raise its gun by 20 degrees or lower it by 9. This gives the Abrams greater range than its Russian competitor. The lack of mobility for Russian tank guns also makes them vulnerable in urban combat, contributing to Russian tank losses in Ukraine just as it did in Chechnya. So Russia began the war in Ukraine with a largely outdated series of tanks with design problems that made them prone to catastrophic destruction and ensured that they would lack range and firepower. Because Ukraine started the war with the same kind of outdated tanks, it suffered an armor destruction ratio comparable to its Russian adversary. However, as Ukraine received thousands of modern portable anti-tank weapons like the Javelin, it was able to pile up the damage on Russian tanks in other ways. Russia's staggering losses of its more modern tanks like the T-72, T-80 and T-90 have forced it to dig deeper into its tank fleet and break older models out of storage. The older tanks include the T-64 models that Ukraine has been using, which were designed in the early 1960s. Russia has also used the T-62 tank, the T-64's predecessor, which saw its origins in the 1950s, and even in some cases the T-54-55, which had its genesis in the 1940s as a successor to the legendary World War II-era T-34. These old tanks have been deployed in Ukraine without any visible upgrades, such as bricks of explosive reactive armor to better protect them from anti-tank rounds. Perhaps it's for this reason that Russian sources indicate that the T-54-55 tanks in particular have been deployed more as mobile armored artillery vehicles designed for indirect fire assistance. This role seems corroborated by Oryx, as only 2 T-54-55 type tanks have been reported as visually confirmed casualties, despite their lack of protective armor against modern weapons. One of the tanks was destroyed and the other damaged. Russian sources reported in May 2023 that the T-54-55 has been deployed to Ukraine at the company level. Like other tanks in Ukraine, T-54-55 models have been spotted with cope cages as an ad hoc method to protect against drones and anti-tank missiles. Russia originally wanted the T-62 and its variants in the indirect role that the T-54-55 has been deployed in, but the huge losses of T-72 tanks have forced it to usher in this old tank and the T-64 into frontline direct combat in larger numbers, putting it in the same position as its enemy Ukraine was at the start of the war. According to Oryx, Russia has lost 85 T-62 tanks across its multiple variants, 35 of which have been destroyed, a rate of about 41%. Meanwhile, Russia has lost 78 T-64 tanks, 60 of which have been destroyed, making for a much higher destruction rate of about 77%. The destruction of so many Russian tanks in Ukraine has led to a peculiar phenomenon. As Russia is breaking its Cold War relics out of storage, its Ukrainian enemy is getting a steady supply of Western tanks, which are much more highly survivable and come with more firepower. For example, as damaged Leopard tanks get repaired, more could be coming from Europe in 2024. Germany has pledged that an additional 14 Leopard tanks will be delivered in early 2024 to replace the ones Ukraine has lost. Meanwhile, in November 2023, Germany and Switzerland made a deal to send even more Leopard tanks to Ukraine, adding to the latter's fleet, according to a report by David Axe in Forbes. In the late 1980s, Switzerland bought 380 PZ-87 tanks, which are variants of the Leopard 2A4. While Switzerland upgraded some of these tanks in the 2010s, it put 96 unmodified tanks in storage. Ukraine has long desired these. But Switzerland has centuries of tradition of being a neutral country. Then, on November 22, 2023, the Swiss agreed to export 25 of these tanks to the German Rheinmetall Company, which manufactures automobiles and arms. Technically, the condition the Swiss demanded is that these tanks must remain in NATO or EU territory to meet existing shortfalls. However, there is a loophole that the Swiss gave a wink and a nod to. Rheinmetall is empowered to sell these tanks to a country that already operates Leopard 2A4s, perhaps with German government financing, and that country could then donate to Ukraine its own Leopard 2A4s. So Rheinmetall could sell these tanks to Germany, for example. Germany would then be able to donate them to Ukraine. If these 25 tanks were to arrive in conjunction with the 14 Germany has already pledged, it would make up for the destroyed Leopards and then some, amounting to a new battalion of tanks. As Ukraine's tank force gets steadily more modern, Russia is finding it more and more difficult to replace its best tanks, and as a result, its tank force is getting older and more vulnerable to modern weapons. These older tanks are often not even able to fight at night, unlike the newer Western tanks that are coming into the service of Ukraine. This reality paints a grim picture for Russia as the war continues into its third year. It will need to rely more and more on throwing sheer numbers at the problems facing it. However, Russia's tank problems in Ukraine go far beyond old models and design flaws. While many tanks have been destroyed, many others have been lost due to capture or abandonment. Russian doctrine heavily emphasizes tanks and artillery. In comparison, Western doctrine emphasizes a combined arms approach to warfare. Urban fighting in Iraq helped to flesh this doctrine out. Tanks proved vulnerable without proper infantry support, especially in tighter environments like cities. As a result, dismounted infantry proved critical to supporting the tanks. Russia, on the other hand, learned nothing from its bitter experiences in the Chechen wars of the 1990s, where guerrillas armed with anti-tank weapons would wreak havoc on the Russian armor from rooftops, high windows, or when emerging from basements. When Russia deployed its vast tank fleet to Ukraine, it again failed to provide its tanks with proper infantry support, learning nothing from its experiences in Chechnya. Long columns of Russian tanks without proper infantry support, often in urban settings, proved vulnerable to the ambushes of Ukrainian anti-tank crews. As we've seen, because of their tanks' design problems, many of Russia's best tank crews became casualties in the earliest phases of the war, when Russia's attacks stalled outside of Kyiv and every other axis except in the southern one that emerged from Crimea. Russian tanks typically come in crews of 3, the commander, driver, and gunner. If we take the visually confirmed loss estimates by Oryx and multiply the 1,621 tanks destroyed by 3, it would yield a number of 4,863 tank crews becoming casualties in Ukraine. Because Russian tanks tend to blow up in catastrophic destruction thanks to their design flaws, most of these can be assumed to be KIA. These numbers are only rough estimates. They may be higher or lower. Ukrainian sources claimed in the summer of 2023 that Russia has lost over 4,000 tanks in the war. Although because this information is coming from a warring party, it must be treated with skepticism. It is noteworthy, though, that foreign experts have often roughly agreed with Ukraine's figures. For example, Frederick Martins of the Hague Center for Strategic Studies said they were probable in an interview with Newsweek. Regardless, the loss of Russian tank crews has been high because of the thousands of tanks destroyed. Since Russia almost certainly lost thousands of its best-trained tank operators in the early stages of the war, it's had to replace them with poorly trained and motivated new recruits. Much like their mobilized infantry counterparts in places like Bakhmut, Russia's modus operandi has simply been to throw these amateurish crews and outdated tanks into the teeth of the enemy. Russia's problems go further. According to Oryx, at least 176 tanks have been abandoned, and a further 548 captured. The real number is probably higher. In contrast, only 37 Ukrainian tanks have been abandoned and 133 captured, ratios of 4.75 to 1 and 4.1 to 1 in favor of Ukraine. Why have the Russians lost so many tanks to abandonment? One of the reasons is that Russia has had problems deploying retrieval vehicles into Ukraine. These vehicles are designed to recover immobilized or damaged armored equipment. The comparative lack of these recovery vehicles in the Russian military is nothing new and date back to the Soviet era. According to Oryx, Russia has lost a total of 88 armored recovery vehicles. 39 of them have been destroyed and the rest damaged or abandoned. Ukrainian forces have often been seen targeting Russian recovery vehicles with drones. Each loss adds even greater stress to Russia's armed forces. Meanwhile, Ukraine is converting some of its older T-62 tanks into armored recovery vehicles to assist its newer Western tanks. Russian problems go deeper still. Many tanks have needed to be abandoned because of a lack of spare parts or proper mechanics to service them. A comparison with the US military might bring things into perspective. The US Army deploys about 10 support soldiers for every combat soldier to maintain smooth logistics. The Russian Army in Ukraine has had far fewer support soldiers, with only about 150 in a typical battalion tactical group being in that category. Each BTG has about 700 to 900 soldiers. Russia, despite being one of the world's leading energy producers, has also suffered fuel shortages in Ukraine. Lack of access to rail hubs that it needs to move equipment and clogged roads have made it hard for Russia to keep its tanks fueled. Ukraine's HIMARS attacks on Russian fuel depots and other important logistical centers have only added greater stress to Russia's tank problems, especially with their constant lack of proper infantry support. In sum, Russia's tank failure in Ukraine is the result of all things coming together. Outdated Soviet-era designs make Russian tanks prone to complete destruction, especially against modern anti-tank weapons. Poor doctrine ensures that these tanks often lack adequate infantry support to prevent ambushes, a fact which is shown over and over again at the hands of Ukrainian soldiers armed with portable anti-tank equipment and drones. Finally, poor Russian logistics ensures that tanks often cannot be recovered, repaired, or fueled, which is why so many of them have been abandoned or captured. Russia may have had the world's largest tank force before the war, but it's lost its best tanks at a staggering rate, with events proving that they were not so great after all. Tanks still may be a formidable force on the modern battlefield, but without proper infantry support, they are vulnerable, and without logistical support, they are for all practical purposes immobile. Russia is therefore left with a rapidly aging tank force, which it's throwing en masse into an attritional meat grinder, hoping to bleed Ukraine out so it becomes too exhausted to fight any further. The traditional Russian way of war. What else do you think is responsible for Russia's huge tank failures in Ukraine? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. In this video, we're diving into an astonishing story. How Ukraine managed to shoot down 11 Russian aircraft in just 11 days, dealing a significant blow to Russia's already struggling air campaign. But what does this mean in the larger context of the air war as of March 2024? What are the risks and challenges both sides are now facing? We'll spotlight the downing of 8 Su-34s, 2 Su-35s, and notably one Beriev A-50 radar plane, a particularly rare and notable achievement. But how did Ukraine pull off this impressive feat, especially against the Beriev A-50? And what impact has this had on the tactics and morale of both the Ukrainian and Russian forces? Stay with us as we unpack these critical moments and their implications in the ongoing conflict. The Beriev A-50, akin to America's E-3 Sentry, plays a crucial role as an airborne early warning and control (AWACS) aircraft. These AWACS planes are vital for command, communications, and control within a war zone's airspace. But what specific functions have these planes served in the Ukrainian conflict? Well, Russia's AWACS planes have helped to detect incoming missiles and connect troops on the front line with their headquarters, which are usually hundreds of miles away. The comms link provided by the A-50 has magnified in importance after Russia needed to move such headquarters further back from the line to guard against HIMARS attacks. Each A-50 comes with a crew of up to 15 men. However, a video released on February 23rd seemed to show the wreckage of an A-50 in the Russian territory of Krasnodar Krai, east of the Sea of Azov. The loss was in fact the second loss of an A-50 plane this year, following on the heels of an incident in January. Ukrainian sources claim that 5 majors, 3 captains, a lieutenant, and a sergeant major were killed in the attack. The loss of experienced airmen like these is as big a blow to the Russian aerospace forces as the loss of the aircraft itself. But how did Ukraine manage such a precise and impactful strike? It appears that the January incident was executed using one of Ukraine's Patriot missile batteries. Russia has guarded its A-50 planes from Ukrainian air defenses by typically deploying them outside the 75-mile range of the S-300 air defense system, which Ukraine has in good numbers. Unfortunately for the Kremlin, the Patriot with its PAC-2 missile has a 90-mile range, and the Russian brass seems not to have expected Ukraine to use its newer air defense systems in this way. Here's the interesting part though. The February incident might have involved an S-200 air defense system from the Cold War. The A-50 targeted in that incident was positioned at least 120 miles away from the front lines, a distance beyond the reach of the PAC-2 missile. This leads to a crucial question. What enabled the Ukrainians to strike at such a distance? It turns out the Soviet-era S-200's 5V-28 missile was the key, possessing the necessary range to make this strike possible. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had about 16 S-200 systems spread across the country. Initially, with the war's outbreak, Ukraine brought some of these systems out of storage, using them mainly against ground targets, including targets within Russian territory. Now it appears Ukraine is employing the S-200 for its intended purpose, aerial defense. But what challenges has Ukraine faced in adapting these Soviet-era systems to modern warfare? The S-200, while a powerful system, has its drawbacks when compared to the Patriot. It's far less accurate, and the 5V-28 missile is heavy at 8 tons, including a 500-pound warhead, making it difficult to transport. However, the Ukrainians seem to have improved its accuracy with small GPS seekers installed in place of the traditional guidance system. Against a target with a lack of maneuverability like the A-50, this seems to be more than enough. To make matters worse for the Russian aerospace forces, Ukraine might have as many as 1,000 5V-28 missiles in its arsenal and have assistance from the Poles to maintain the chemicals needed to propel them. A third A-50 was damaged in a drone strike last year. The loss of these planes is a heavy blow to Russia's Air Force. Only about 40 A-50s were ever made, and Russia had only 9 modernized A-50s available before the start of the war. It now has just 7, and only 6 are operational. Russian industry is now scrambling to replace the lost planes, but this will come at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. Russia has also been trying to field the A-50's successor, the A-100, but there is only one of these, and sanctions mean that it will be more difficult for Russia to get its hands on the electronics this plane needs to operate. In the meantime, Russia's ability to control the skies over Ukraine, particularly in the south around the all-important Crimea, has weakened. Ukraine's destruction of the A-50s flying near its airspace has eliminated about a third of the sensor coverage that Russia's air fleet can create. This results in a lack of information that could make other planes vulnerable. Crimea has also been put at elevated risk in another way. Raids last year knocked out some of the ground-based radars on the peninsula. Russia turned to the A-50 to plug the gap. The loss of the two A-50s make Crimea even more prone to drone and missile attacks, which have already forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to retreat from Sevastopol, its traditional base. Russia will therefore have good reason to keep its AWACS aircraft even further back from the front, harming C&C and making Russian forces less adaptable, particularly with their top-heavy command structure, which discourages initiative in junior officers. You can expect more drone and missile strikes on Crimea and other targets of opportunity as Russia's eyes in the sky grow less capable. Russia had once counted on its A-50s to cover 3 broad areas in the south, east, and north to extend sensor coverage across the entire front in eastern Ukraine. Each of these 3 areas would have 3 A-50s on coverage. But what happens now when one of these planes has been damaged and 2 destroyed? It seems Putin is steadily losing his ability to cover the front. Ukraine's successes in downing these Russian planes has effectively multiplied its forces' combat effectiveness, facilitating easier targeting of other Russian aircraft and enabling surprise attacks on ground positions. This brings up a crucial point. How has Ukraine been adapting and using other air defense systems, not just for defense, but also as offensive tools? Alongside these strikes, Ukraine has been creatively employing its NASAMS systems, which are likely contributing to the recent downing of additional Russian aircraft. NASAMS are equipped with missiles like the AIM-9X Sidewinder and the AIM-120 AMRAAM, typically found on fighter jets. Increasingly, around February 26th, Russian forces destroyed one of Ukraine's NASAMS near Zaporizhia, indicating that these systems might be deployed closer to the front lines for offensive operations against Russian aircraft. NASAMS also has interoperability with the longer-range Patriot system, allowing for greater coverage against varieties of targets at different ranges and altitudes. With its Raytheon MPQ-64F1 Sentinel radar, it has 360-degree coverage and can track and acquire targets at ranges of up to 75 miles. The NASAM-2's AMRAAM missile has an effective range of about 48 miles. The NASAM-3's AMRAAM range goes further, up to about 80 miles. The Patriot's PAC-2's 90-mile range reinforces these operations if the two systems are used in conjunction. Both systems are probably being used as part of a mobile air defense strategy, being moved to hotspots along the front line in response to increased Russian sorties and then quickly moving away to avoid a retaliatory response from the Russian Air Force. Because the Patriot and NASAMS are mobile, they can move in and out as needed, although multiple vehicles will be needed for this, making the operation riskier should the Russians have good intelligence on where these systems will be deployed. But if Ukrainian forces are taking risks in the way they've begun to use these systems, the Russian forces are taking additional risks of their own, and the increased downing of Russian aircraft in recent days has as much to do with a shift in Russian strategy as it does a mobile, adaptable use of air defense systems by the Ukrainian troops near the front. After the fall of Avdiivka in February 2024, Ukraine's situation became increasingly dire, with a noticeable shortage of ammunition. This development has emboldened Russian ground forces, and consequently, their air force has begun flying more sorties closer to the front lines than ever before. But what does this change in Russian tactics reveal about their strategy and confidence in the air? Throughout most of the conflict, Russia has been cautious about risking aircraft losses. Notably, it has refrained from deploying its latest 5th-generation Su-57 Felon fighter jet over Ukrainian airspace. However, Russia's attitude in the deployment of its air force is now starting to change. According to Ukraine's Center for Defense Strategies think tank, the enemy has overcome the fear of using aviation directly over the battlefield, and although this results in the loss of aircraft, their ground forces gain a significant firepower advantage. CDS reports that Russia is increasingly utilizing aircraft to support operations on various fronts, including in the areas around the villages of Ivanivka, Bodanivka, and Hiraivka in Donetsk Oblast. These operations involve the use of guided bombs from aircraft, helicopters, and heavy artillery, assisting in the movement of armored vehicles, some recently relocated from Avdiivka. Vuhledar, a small city in Donetsk Oblast, which has been a target of multiple unsuccessful Russian offensives, is witnessing intensified attacks, with additional troops deployed from Avdiivka. In these regions, especially from the east and northeast, Russian forces are now receiving more substantial air support than before. This strategy has led to the capture of the village of Popida and has potentially opened the road to Vuhledar, a development that merits close observation in the upcoming weeks. These shifts suggest a significant change in tactics on the Donbass front. Russian tanks and infantry, which had previously operated with limited air support, are now receiving more coordinated aerial backing in their offensive maneuvers. The increasing use of Russian aircraft closer to the battlefield opens a new branch in the ongoing war of attrition. How much damage can Russia's Air Force take in exchange for the gains the increased air support will give to Moscow's war effort? On paper, Russia should be able to take the punishment more than Ukraine. Before the war, it had the world's second largest number of combat aircraft between its military branches, with 4,182. Of these, about 900 were tactical aircraft. However, Russia cannot easily replace its losses in aircraft because of the sanctions imposed on it by technology-rich countries. Although Russia has adapted to sanctions and is producing vehicles and drones at what appears to be an adequate rate, this does not appear to be the case with aircraft. As of now, production rates in Russia amount to perhaps 24 new planes per year, according to David Axe of Forbes. One of the examples outlined in the report is with the fourth-generation Su-34 fighter jet. Russia had about 140 of these before the war, but has since lost 31. 109 thus remain. Russia cannot make up for these losses with its current production rates. Meanwhile, the new aircraft Russia can produce will likely have inferior systems due to the sanctions. The Oryx blog can provide some more details about the state of the air war. Oryx counts only visually confirmed losses, but it provides a reasonably accurate estimate of the overall situation. According to it, Russia has lost a total of 105 aircraft throughout the war as of March 2024, with 97 of them being destroyed and 8 damaged. In addition to the Su-34 fighters it has lost, Russia has lost 31 Su-25 close support aircraft, 14 Su-24 type aircraft, and 7 Su-35 fighter aircraft. The Su-35 is supposed to be Russia's most advanced fighter, other than the Su-57. Aside from these, Russia has lost a pair of Tu-22M3 strategic bombers, with one destroyed and one damaged on the ground. One Tu-95MS strategic bomber has also been damaged on the ground. 6 Il-76 transport aircraft have become casualties, with 3 destroyed, 2 damaged beyond repair, and 1 damaged on the ground. One AN-26 transport was destroyed in a non-combat related incident. 3 Il-22 airborne command posts have suffered as well, with 1 destroyed, 1 damaged beyond repair, and 1 damaged. Not only are these lost aircraft difficult to repair and replace, their inability to take to the skies puts additional pressure on Russia's existing aircraft. Fewer planes need to take on more responsibilities, increasing the wear and tear on their airframes, demand for dwindling spare parts, and fatigue on Russian pilots and crew chiefs. In a RAND Corporation report from August 2023, Michael Bonnet, a mechanical engineer working for the think tank, estimated that the extra hours the conflict has demanded on its aircraft has effectively cost Russia an additional 27 to 57 imputed plane losses. Aircraft have a lifespan. They are designed with a total number of expected flight hours, which are used roughly evenly over the life of the aircraft and segmented with periodic maintenance and inspection. For example, if an aircraft is designed for 3,000 flight hours with an expected use of 30 years, the aircraft will fly roughly 100 hours per year. If during an inspection, wear on the plane is found to be more or less than expected, the projected remaining hours are adjusted accordingly. These numbers dictate all sorts of planning, from fuel procurement to ground maintenance to pilot training. Imputed losses means that the Russians have burned through more of the expected lifespan of their aircraft more quickly than anticipated. To make up for it, they'll have to procure more aircraft, increase maintenance, reduce operations, or accept a smaller force, or some combination of those. Even in the early stages of the war, when the Russian Air Force was more cautious and at the height of its power, it was flying between 150 and 300 sorties per day, compared to the peacetime rate of about 60. Although Russia had decreased its sorties by becoming even more cautious in the face of unexpected Ukrainian resistance, it still flew about 100 sorties a day at the low mark. Now that number is increasing again, and the burden is concentrated on fewer aircraft. In August 2023, Bonnet predicted that by the summer of 2024, the Russian Air Force would be below 75% of its pre-war strength due to the aircraft lost in combat or depletion through additional wear and tear. Bonnet says that the Russian aerospace forces will need to either increase production, reduce usage, or reduce force structure for the next 30 years to make up for these losses, although he did note that the Russian Air Force was not in a horrible position despite the casualties. David Axe concludes that because of the increased wear and tear and the depletion of spare parts to keep planes in repair, the Russian Air Force might be down to about 700 effective combat aircraft. For now, Russia has the mass to sustain these losses, but soon it might have no choice but to become more cautious about deploying its aircraft into combat on the front again. The Ukrainians have another card to play, which should arrive on the battlefield this year. In August 2023, Ukraine finally got approval to use F-16 fighter jets, which it had desired since the beginning of the war. The initial delivery was slated for 42 planes, but it is possible that Ukraine could get over 60 F-16s. These F-16s will be faster and have better radar than the original F-16 from the early 1980s, and they will be a big improvement compared to the Soviet-era MiG-29 Ukraine currently operates as its standard aircraft. However, there is another big problem for Ukraine, as training the pilots and delivering the plane has taken precious time, and not all of the F-16s will arrive at once. 12 Ukrainian pilots are currently being taught to fly the F-16 in the United States. They are based at Morris Air National Guard Base in Tucson, Arizona, where their training started last October. The Arizona National Guard expects the pilots to graduate between May and August. Ukrainian pilots are also being trained in the United Kingdom, Denmark, and Romania. But while the pilots may be nearing the end of their training, there is still no word on when they and their planes will arrive on the battlefield. In February, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that it would be impossible to say when exactly the F-16s would arrive, because the planes not only need well-trained pilots, but the support crews and systems to keep them combat ready. Denmark's defense ministry said in January that the first 6 of the 19 F-16s it's donated to Ukraine would arrive there sometime in the second quarter of 2022. Yuri Inat, a press official for Ukraine's Airforce, said that the 6 pilots for those planes would be ready by spring. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba only confirmed that the F-16 will arrive into the war-torn country sometime later this year. According to him, 150 F-16s would be enough to secure Ukrainian airspace. So what do you think? Will the Ukrainians be able to defend their line against Russian air sorties before the F-16 arrives? Let us know in the comments. Now go and check out why Russia is afraid of F-16s in Ukraine, or click this other video instead. And make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. The prolonged conflict in Ukraine, now stretching well into its 3rd year, has witnessed relentless Ukrainian resilience against formidable odds. While Russian forces have claimed minor territorial gains since the fall of Avdiivka in February, the reality is that these are costly and largely symbolic. Ukraine's strategic countermaneuvers and the staunch defense of key positions like northern Donetsk Oblast and the areas surrounding Bakhmut and Vuhledar in Zaporizhia Oblast underscore a narrative not just of survival, but of calculated resistance. This strategic endurance is all the more remarkable given Ukraine's current artillery challenges. Dubbed shell hunger, this shortfall has seen daily artillery discharges dwindle from 10,000 shells to roughly 2,000. This, coupled with damage to many Ukrainian howitzers due to precise Russian counter-battery efforts and new drone tactics, has undeniably strained Ukraine's defensive capabilities. Yet despite these setbacks, the spirit of Ukrainian forces remains unbroken. In contrast to the narrative of Russian advancement, the reality of the battlefield tells a different story. Russian forces, despite an extensive artillery arsenal and support from rogue states like North Korea, are achieving only marginal gains at an unsustainable cost. Their reliance on volume over tactical efficiency has not translated into decisive success, highlighting the inefficiencies and desperation underlying their military strategy. Amid these challenging dynamics, a beacon of support shines from Denmark. This Scandinavian ally has stepped up, ready to alter the course of events with significant artillery contributions. This move is not just a military aid package, it's a symbol of a shifting European foreign policy landscape that increasingly seeks to support Ukraine's staunch defense efforts. But how transformative could Denmark's involvement be, and what does this mean for the balance of power on the front lines? As Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umerov advocates for more Western artillery and ammunition, Denmark's commitment could very well be a game-changer. Providing the much-needed artillery might not only alleviate Ukraine's shell hunger, but could also empower Ukrainian forces to reclaim momentum. This support from Denmark and other Western nations underscores a collective international commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and resilience, setting the stage for a pivotal shift in the ongoing conflict. But how exactly is Denmark stepping up in this crucial hour? Before we explore their pivotal contributions, let's rewind to the events that set this commitment in motion. Just 2 days after the fall of Avdiivka, a bold announcement came from the north. Denmark pledged to donate all of its existing artillery units to Ukraine. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen broke sharply with Europe's cautious stance on arms support, criticizing the continent's hesitancy and highlighting the available resources. This is not only a question about production, because we have weapons, we have ammunition, we have air defenses that we don't have to use ourselves at the moment, that we should deliver to Ukraine. With this declaration, Denmark not only promised critical military support, but also challenged other nations to reassess their positions. You see, to prove the point that such a donation would not be crippling to its arsenal, Denmark's Ministry of Defense said it was in the process of acquiring new military capabilities on a rapid basis to make up for the loss of units. In Munich, Frederiksen also stressed the importance of not waiting for a politically divided United States to take the lead on supplying the Ukrainians. It doesn't matter what the US comes up with. We Europeans have to defend ourselves. This is a war on the European continent. Frederiksen's remarks were the latest example of Denmark's evolving geopolitical strategy, and it's helpful to see Copenhagen's artillery donation in that light. Although Denmark was one of the founding members of the NATO alliance in 1949 and played a pivotal geostrategic role thanks to its control of the Baltic's western choke points, its overall level of security integration with the rest of Europe was not as well advanced. Until June 2022, Denmark was the only one of the European nation's 27 member states which did not participate in the latter's common security policy. Denmark did not take part in the EU defense discussions, nor get involved with the joint military missions. These opt-outs originated with Denmark's initial rejection of the Maastricht Treaty in a 1992 referendum. To secure Denmark's accession to the European Union, Copenhagen was granted a number of exceptions to the Maastricht Treaty through the Edinburgh Agreement. One of these involved defense issues. With these opt-outs in place, Danish voters agreed to join the EU on such terms in a second referendum the following year. This security opt-out policy was in tradition with Denmark's Cold War footing. Although it was a member of NATO, Denmark did not allow any foreign forces on its soil under the alliance's auspices. The Soviet Union was the dominant power in the Baltic and had troops in nearby Germany, troops which outnumbered the West's. Denmark wanted to place itself under America's nuclear umbrella, but did not otherwise want to risk upsetting the Soviet Union. Recent historical experience reminded Danish policymakers of the importance of this goal. British forces only barely prevented the Red Army from pushing on to Denmark when they captured the city of Lübeck in northern Germany on May 2, 1945, only hours before Soviet troops came into the area. The Soviet Union had also occupied the Danish island of Bornholm, which sits on strategic territory in the Baltic, since the previous year. Bornholm is an island roughly in the middle of the strait between Sweden's southern coast and Poland's northern one. A military presence there can cut off movement between east and west in the Baltic. Fortunately for the Danes on Bornholm, Stalin agreed to withdraw the Red Army from the island and did so in April 1946, thus making it a rare example of the Iron Curtain receding in the immediate post-World War II era. However, Stalin's move only came with the understanding that Denmark would not host foreign troops on its soil, even though it was in the West's sphere of influence. American and British policymakers quietly agreed about this, and the unspoken agreement held throughout the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, Denmark slackened on its defense spending. It last spent 2% of its GDP on defense in 1989 and fell to a low of 1.1% in 2015. But that's now starting to change too, as it further integrated itself with European and NATO security networks and gradually ended the policy of quasi-neutrality. Denmark also pledged that it would increase its defense spending and hit the 2% mark by 2033, although there will undoubtedly be many voices in the West that say this rate of increase is too slow. Either way, recent moves in Denmark suggest that its long period of relative military neutrality is coming to an end, and this policy shift has been sanctioned by Danish voters. On June 1, 2022, Denmark held a referendum that asked a simple question. Do you vote yes or no on Denmark being able to participate in the European defense and security cooperation by abolishing the EU defense opt-out? Amidst Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Danish voters chose yes by a margin of nearly 67 to 32%. The vote therefore ended Copenhagen's comparative military isolation from the rest of Europe. The result meant that Danish troops could participate in joint military operations under the EU's banner and have more of an influence in joint European defense policy. More importantly, the result of the referendum made it far easier for the Danish military to acquire weapons and equipment, which is one of the reasons why Copenhagen understands that it can donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Russia reacted negatively to the news and stopped supplying natural gas to one of Denmark's power companies. Although this did not significantly affect Denmark's energy supply, the move was another demonstration of Russia's willingness to use coercive methods as a means of statecraft. These maneuvers on the part of Moscow likely only further convinced Danish voters that they had made the right decision. Even before the invasion, Denmark was signaling the beginning of its seismic shift in security policy. As Russia was gathering its forces along the Ukrainian border and an invasion seemed imminent, PM Frederiksen suggested that negotiations were ongoing with the United States on a new bilateral defense agreement that could station American troops and military equipment on Danish soil for the first time. Danish Defense Minister Morten Bødskov said any new agreement would be designed to give American forces better access to Europe. The agreement would also likely allow for more cross-training between American and Danish troops, and perhaps more importantly, could make acquiring new military equipment and ammunition easier for the Danes. Once it joined the broader European defense community, Denmark demonstrated its disproportionate willingness to supply Ukraine. It's one of the major donors of F-16 fighter jets, supplying the Ukrainians with 19 of them, which should be sent out by 2025. This is the broader context behind Denmark's more recent decision to donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Copenhagen's donation of artillery amounts to a small sum, as it has no MLRS units or towed artillery. Rather, the GFI lists Denmark as having 19 self-propelled artillery units, with 15 of them being in a state of readiness. These units are the French-made Caesar self-propelled howitzer. The Caesar entered service in 2008 and has an operational range of about 600 kilometers, with a crew between 3 and 5 operators. Each unit has a typical magazine of 36 shells. The Caesar fires NATO standard 155mm ammunition up to a range of 34 kilometers and up to 42 kilometers when using an extended range full-bore shell (ERFB). These rounds were originally designed by the Canadian artillery engineer Gerard Bull, who became famous for working on the concept of Saddam Hussein's Project Babylon superguns, Big Babylon and Baby Babylon. Bull was assassinated in 1990, possibly by Israeli agents who did not want to see the Iraqis' superguns become a reality. Unlike standard rounds, these shells are longer and thinner. ERFB rounds have peculiar nubs around their midsections, which help to engage the rifling in the gun and stabilize the projectile in flight, although later ERFB rounds may not have these. ERFB rounds have significantly increased range compared to a standard shell, but at the cost of reduced accuracy. The decreased accuracy has meant that the ERFB round has not become a NATO standard, but the Caesar is nevertheless capable of firing it. The Caesar can increase its range even further, up to a range of 52 kilometers, when it uses rocket-assisted shells. Each Caesar costs about $7.5 million per unit, but the pricing depends on individual contracts. As an example, the acquisition of 52 Caesar howitzers was approved by the Czech Ministry of Defense on September 1, 2021, and the value of that contract is around $288 million. The Caesar has to this point performed well in the war. Correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but it may be more than coincidental that after Ukraine started to receive its Caesar guns, Russian artillery units began to suffer heavy losses. Its introduction, therefore, seems to have coincided with better Ukrainian counter-battery fire. At the height of the Ukrainian gunners' effectiveness, the Russians were supposedly losing between 20 and 40 artillery systems per day. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the Caesar was not enough to turn the tide, as the Russians dug in with the benefit of the most elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since the First World War. Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia campaign failed to reach even its first objective, the road junction at Tokmak. As of April 2024, the Oryx blog lists a visually confirmed 8 losses of Caesar units. 5 have been destroyed and 3 damaged. Denmark's donation of its 19 Caesars comes amid new French donations of the unit. Sensing the desperate shortage of artillery for the Ukrainians, France announced in January that it intended to deliver an additional 78 Caesar units to Ukraine and sought €280 million to assist with 60 of these. While Denmark was already sending all of its Caesar artillery units to Ukraine by April 2023, Frederiksen's remarks in Munich were an announcement that it would be sending a different system there too. In addition to the Caesar units, Denmark has 21 X-21 Cardon mortars, which will now be on their way to Ukraine. The Cardon was originally created in Israel and can be chambered to fire 81 or 120mm shells. The 120mm Cordon is muzzle-loaded, but despite this, the mortar has a burst rate of 16 rounds per minute and a sustained rate of fire of around 4 rounds per minute. The Cardom operates on an autonomous recoil system and is controlled by computers, although it can be laid and targeted manually with its backup handles and optical sights if the computerized fire control is compromised. The Cardom has an effective range of about 7.2 kilometers. To improve accuracy, the Danes decided to equip their Cardom mortars with MVRS 700SC muzzle velocity radar systems manufactured by their domestic Weibel company. This system takes account of atmospheric conditions like temperature and humidity, which influence the conditions in the barrel and therefore the muzzle velocity of the mortar's round, which in turn influences the accuracy of its fire. The MVRS 700SC's presence allows the Danish Cardom systems to compensate for environmental conditions and improve their accuracy. This radar system is integrated with the Cardom's computerized fire control system through an antenna and a processor. The Danes received the Cardom in 2019 and specifically sought to use it as mobile firepower. Following Russia's original intervention in Ukraine in 2014, one of the lessons Denmark took away was the vulnerability of artillery to counter battery fire thanks to radar and drone detection. To adapt to this reality, the Danes decided to integrate the Israeli Cardom mortar with their new Piranha 5 armored personnel carrier. The integration better allows the Cardom to deliver fire support and then move away before the enemy can spot it and retaliate. Denmark's decision to send its entire artillery force to Ukraine is the latest sign of a gradually changing philosophy among the Western powers. As the war commenced, Western nations were cautious about escalating the conflict, hesitating to supply Ukraine with high-impact weaponry such as long-range ballistic and cruise missiles. This cautious stance began to shift dramatically in 2023, marked by significant support, including main battle tanks, cluster bombs, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and the pivotal American ATACMS for Ukraine's HIMARS units. Despite these substantial commitments, which initially raised concerns about escalation, the successful utilization of these systems by Ukraine in 2022 helped to alleviate fears, shifting the focus toward the potential depletion of Western arsenals. Years of peace, along with a focus on counter-terrorism, had not prepared the West for the intense demands of modern, high-intensity warfare, where sophisticated ammunition is consumed at an alarming rate. This concern is compounded by the complexity and vulnerability of the supply chains needed to produce and distribute modern precision munitions. Yet the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen argued that supporting Ukraine, even at the expense of Western stockpiles, was a strategic necessity. In her view, a Russian defeat in Ukraine would ultimately enhance Western security more reliably than maintaining large arsenals at home. While Denmark's contribution of artillery might not decisively tip the scales of the war, Frederiksen hoped her bold move would catalyze broader European support, encouraging a more substantial collective effort. This hope seemed to be materializing when, at a Munich conference, Czech defense official Jan Jiras revealed that 800,000 artillery shells could be procured from non-Western stockpiles for Ukraine at a cost of $1.5 billion, proposing a feasible solution to swiftly bolster Ukraine's artillery capabilities. His announcement underscored a growing willingness among European nations to find innovative ways to support Ukraine's defense and maintain the momentum in its counteroffensive efforts. On March 8th, Czech President Petr Pavel announced that a group of 18 countries had funded the purchase of all of those shells in full. Germany alone would buy 180,000 rounds with a price tag of $618 million, which amounted to 40% of the total. Denmark also participated in the financing alongside Belgium, the Netherlands, and Canada. The effort that Denmark contributed to resulted in the procurement of about 400,000 of the shells. At about the same time, the Czechs identified a further 700,000 idle artillery shells that could be purchased for $1.8 billion. Ukraine's Western allies, including Denmark, have agreed to purchase these also. Thanks to Europe's collective efforts, Ukraine's artillery and shell shortage looks like it will end by this summer. When the Czech-brokered ammunition begins to arrive, the expected date of delivery is June. As the summer matures, Ukraine might begin to fire around 6,000 shells per day, 3 times as many as now. The number might grow further to 10,000 per day, now that the divided United States Congress has decided to deliver additional aid. Ukraine's shell hunger is about to end. And the way in which it will come to an end is an item of evidence in favor of PM Frederiksen's notion of the need for Europe to take the lead in its own defense. For her, defeating Russia in Ukraine now, even if it means a depletion of valuable military stockpiles at home, is a preferable option to using those weapons in a future on one's own doorstep in another, worse conflict down the line. But will the rest of Europe follow suit? Do you agree with PM Frederiksen? Should Western countries send much more of their available arsenals to Ukraine? Is this the best way for Europe to secure itself from future Russian aggression? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to help the channel and for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out why Russia can't stop US weapons, or click this other video instead. Question: what do coral reefs and much of the Russian Black Sea Fleet have in common? Answer: they're both endangered species and increasingly make for breathtaking underwater tourist attractions. Sure, maybe it's low-hanging fruit, but all jokes aside, Russia only has itself to blame for the current state of its once impressive navy, which most people, Putin included, thought would steamroll Ukraine when they invaded their neighbor in 2022. Ukraine, after all, did not technically even have a navy in the strict sense of the word. First impressions, however, can be deceiving. Over the last 2 years, Russia has managed to lose a combined total of approximately 16 ships and submarines, including the crown jewel of its Black Sea Fleet, the Slava-class cruiser Moskva, sunk by a pair of land-based Neptune anti-ship missiles. These are incredibly steep losses for an alleged great power, especially when you consider that most of the others were sunk by Ukrainian-designed, unmanned maritime drones packed to the rafters with explosives. These ingenious and relatively cheap systems, about $250,000 a pop, have become symbolic of Ukraine's technological savviness and innovative approach to naval warfare. Their asymmetric campaign has resulted in Russia's transformation from the indisputable maritime power in the Black Sea, on paper at least, to being pinned back into the eastern portion and unable to exert sea control over the region. Ordinarily, a military power with as much money, means, and manpower as Russia would double down on the omnipresent threat to its expensive naval assets. If the United States Navy were tasked with defending the Black Sea, it's easy to envision the strategy it would employ. One of its 11 carrier strike groups would almost undoubtedly be deployed to the region, which consists of an aircraft carrier, 2 guided missile cruisers for air defense, 2 LAMPS-capable warships for anti-submarine and surface warfare, and a pair of anti-submarine destroyers or frigates. The fleet would largely be insulated from traditional and hypersonic missile threats with robust and advanced cooperative engagement capabilities, DEW technology, and long-range interceptor missile technology. With enough support ships supplying munitions, fuel, and other supplies, carrier combat aircraft could conduct electronic warfare, hunt for enemy drones, and engage the bases from which they are launched almost indefinitely until the threat was entirely neutralized. US naval assets possess superior radar and electronic warfare suites to down drones, Phalanx CIWS automated guns with 20mm Vulcan cannons, and Skynex-type airburst munitions to engage close-in surface threats and drone swarms, and helicopter-launched missiles to wipe out any drone boats that made it through the fleet's wide defensive perimeter. It would almost be overkill, and the modern US military knows almost no other way. So, why doesn't Russia follow suit? Why not deploy its own aircraft carrier to the Black Sea to help neutralize the Ukrainian maritime fleet of what, in essence, amounts to a bunch of plastic water skis with a GoPro, smartphone, and a big boomstick attached to it? The answer is that it can't. The Russian carrier, known as the Admiral Flotta Sovetskogo Soyuza Kuznetsov, or Admiral Kuznetsov for short, has been undergoing a series of refittings and repairs that have relegated it to dry dock for the past few years. Though it was rumored to be ready to re-enter service by the end of 2024, experts are now wondering whether the carrier will ever sail again. Whatever its future, the vessel won't find itself anywhere near the Black Sea Fleet, or any Russian fleet for that matter, in the near or foreseeable future. Today, we're going to talk about why. If you want to measure a nation's true global power, it's often said that the best way is to look at its navy. But why? Naval vessels are expensive to produce and maintain. Only the richest nations with resources to spare can shoulder the cost of developing, testing, and projecting naval assets across the globe. As the most expensive and complex naval vessel, the modern aircraft carrier is, for good reason, almost universally viewed as the pinnacle of naval power. Those who have them can bring their bombs to bear in almost any corner of the world. Those that don't are forever doomed to the perennial role of a regional power. The history of Russia suggests that it should be at least on par with some of the world's most powerful nations at sea today. Of all Russia's service branches, the Soviet Navy was the fastest to expand after World War II. It had 421 ships of 8 different types, although these figures may be considerably larger. Its submarine fleet was world-renowned, and commensurate with its newfound status as a global power, the Soviets started to employ their navy much like the United States, to project power not just in their own geopolitical neighborhood, but around the world. From the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Arctic to the Pacific, Soviet vessels could be found performing anti-submarine, anti-ship, and anti-aircraft operations throughout the Cold War. The Soviets owed much of their post-1945 naval renaissance to the reforms of one man, Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov, who argued for specialized missile-armed ships and submarines instead of more traditional battleships and heavy cruisers, well ahead of his time. With the seizure of East German shipyards, laboratories, and industries in 1945, Kuznetsov started to turn his vision into reality. He's widely credited for having pressed the Soviets to experiment with hydrofoils, sound-seeking torpedoes, radars, sonars, guided missiles, and other advanced propulsion techniques that kept them apace with American technological advances, and in addition, for elevating the Russian Navy onto equal terms with the General Staff of the Ground Forces, thus setting up the Soviet Union for better joint coordination and strategic success for much of the Cold War. The Soviets adhered to a simple naval strategy at the time. They prioritized nuclear second strike capabilities and then used bombers, submarines, and large surface vessels to threaten NATO's sea lines of communication in the North Atlantic. By the 1970s, rapid advances in Soviet submarine, missile, and nuclear technology enabled them to challenge the United States' previously unquestioned naval supremacy for the first time. It took until 1985, however, for the Soviet Union to build its first aircraft carrier. Built by Black Sea Shipyard in Mykolaiv, Ukraine, the Admiral Kuznetsov was officially commissioned in January 1991 and became fully operational in 1995. After the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, however, everything started to unravel. The Soviet Navy originally intended to launch a sister ship, the Varyag, but the project was disbanded in 1991, where after its incomplete and stripped hull was sold by Ukraine to China, who rebuilt the Varyag as the Liaoning, the People's Liberation Army Navy's first ever aircraft carrier. The Kuznetsov was launched at a time of unprecedented geopolitical turnover and massive budget cuts. It was fatefully marked for an inauspicious future from the start of its turbulent service history. In 1991, Ukraine officially declared its independence from the Soviet Union. That year, acting Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev thwarted a coup attempt by communist hardliners to seize control of the country's political affairs. Gorbachev envisioned a more open, decentralized Soviet government with power distributed among the nation's 15 republics. His reforms may have rubbed the old guard of communist conservatives the wrong way, but they inspired nations like Ukraine, long held under the yoke of Soviet oppression, to exert themselves in foreign affairs. Accordingly, the same year, Ukraine's first elected president, Leonid Kravchuk, told the commander of the Kuznetsov, Viktor Yarygin, that the vessel was Ukraine's rightful property. Kravchuk ordered Yarygin to keep the ship in Sevastopol until the Ukrainian government could figure out what to do. Unfortunately for Kravchuk, Russian naval commander Yuri Ustimenko swooped in and ordered the ship's crew to sail to Russian waters so it could remain in the Soviet fleet. To this day, many Ukrainians still feel the Kuznetsov was unjustly stolen from them. In reality, they may have dodged a bullet. The ship has hung like a broken-down albatross around the neck of the Russian Navy ever since, becoming far more of a burden than a blessing. Before we get into the comically tragic tale of the Kuznetsov's modern service history, let's cover the basics. Relative to modern standards, and especially compared to the nuclear-powered American supercarriers like the Nimitz-class or Ford-class vessels, the Admiral Kuznetsov is modest, unwieldy, and inefficient, and that's putting it mildly. It is 1,000 feet long, it has a 236-foot beam and a 23-foot draft, and displaces 58,000 tons when fully loaded. Steam turbines, turbo-pressurized boilers, 4 shafts, and 4 fixed-pitch propellers drive the vessel through the water, each producing 2,011 horsepower. The ship has a maximum speed of 29 knots. By comparison, the Ford-class carrier, which has unlimited range, displaces double the weight, or 100,000 tons, holds double the aircraft and well over twice the crew, and is over 30 meters longer, can still travel 1 knot faster. The power generated by the Ford-class's 2 A1B nuclear reactors generate 250% more electrical capacity than the Nimitz-class carriers, enabling them to keep pace with far smaller vessels. The Kuznetsov does not run on nuclear power and has a maximum range of 9,800 miles and operational deployment time of 45 days before it must return to port. In their infinite wisdom, when the Soviets laid the keel of their lone carrier, they decided it would run on mazut, an outdated petrochemical that hasn't been used regularly for 50 years. Once seen as an eminently viable fuel for naval energy because of its high volume-to-energy ratio, it was soon found not only to be environmentally unsound, but dangerous for the ship's own crew. Mazut, you see, is incredibly vicious and tar-like. When burned, it emits a cloying, dense cloud of black smoke that clings to sailors' clothing and skin. In 2017, the vessel gained global notoriety when Britain's then Defense Secretary Michael Fallon dubbed it the Ship of Shame, as it passed through the waters close to the English coast, belching black smoke. So what exactly can the Kuznetsov do when it isn't in port topping off its fuel tanks with fresh batches of mazut? On paper, the carrier can carry 18 Su-33s, 6 MiG-29Ks, 4 Ka-31s, and 2 Ka-27s. It's designed to sail alone, and as a result, carries greater firepower than her US counterparts, who rely on escort vessels for mutual protection. Its armaments include 12 SSN-19 shipwreck, long-range high-speed sea-skimming SSMs, 24 VLS units loaded with 192 SAN-9 Gauntlet SAMs, and 8 Kashtan CIWS with dual 30mm machine guns, and 8 AK-630 CIWS. Compared to the 4 Phalanx CIWS and 4 Sea Sparrow launchers, each with 8 missiles carried by the Nimitz class, Admiral Kuznetsov is well armed for both air defense and offensive operations against hostile shipping. The problem, as you'll see later, is merely getting and maintaining the ship in the fight, not the fight itself. The way the Kuznetsov launches its aircraft is perhaps the most recognizable design feature, or flaw, depending on who you ask. Rather than utilize a modernized steam catapult to hurl heavily laden aircraft into the air off the carrier deck at breakneck speed, the Kuznetsov utilizes an old-school bow ramp. You know, the type of thing you and your friends built in grade school to launch your bike into the air in your front yard. The chief flaw of the bow ramp is that it supposes severe limitations on the types of payloads you can launch, which, in turn, constrains the types of missions you can conduct. Physics and gravity exert more of an influence on unassisted bow ramp launch operations. Consequently, the Kuznetsov's crew must adhere to strict takeoff weight limitations, which restrict the amount of ordnance and fuel a jet can carry, and in turn, reduces the jet's offensive effectiveness and range. When the carrier launched in 1995, Russian naval officers were optimistic that the Kuznetsov, deployed in tandem with their powerful submarines, might be able to help their nation remain a major global sea power, even as the country navigated its uncertain future. It didn't take long for fate to take its course. On its first deployment to the Mediterranean in 1996, the carrier was anchored off the port of Tartus, Syria, to conduct its first set of continuous flight operations. At one point during the mission, the carrier's evaporators broke down, stranding thousands of Russian sailors aboard with no fresh water. It was the start of an almost endless stream of technical, mechanical, and engineering issues. Over the next 20 years, Admiral Kuznetsov conducted a series of additional deployments and demonstrations in the Mediterranean, North Sea, Barents Sea, the Atlantic, and the Black Sea. Working with other Russian surface ships, it was pretty common to see the carrier involved in large-scale exercises, rescue operations, escort missions, and naturally, extensive maintenance whenever something broke or needed revitalization. In 2005, one of the carrier's Su-33 aircraft accidentally fell off the back into the Atlantic, one of the first indicators of the vessel's accident-prone reputation. 4 years later, a short circuit sparked a small fire aboard the ship while it was anchored off the Turkish coast. Carbon monoxide poisoning led to the death of one Russian sailor. Just a month later, the carrier found itself in the middle of a massive oil spill that resulted when it tried to refuel at sea with several other Russian vessels off the southern coast of Ireland. The crew was very grateful to return to dry dock for scheduled repairs over the next year. It was business as usual for 2 more years before the next incident struck. In February 2012, after a long, meandering journey around the tip of Scotland and into the Mediterranean, the Admiral Kuznetsov lost propulsion and set adrift in the Bay of Biscay on its return to its home base of Severomorsk. Embarrassingly, the carrier had to be towed the 2,700 miles back to Russia by tugboat, a gesture symbolic of the ship's next decade of service. It would not return to the high seas until 2014, having conducted just 6 overseas patrols across its 23-year lifespan thus far. Still, Russian naval officials were optimistic by the mid-2010s that despite strict financial constraints and recurring technical glitches, the Kuznetsov could remain operational well into the 2030s. Theirs was an incredibly rose-colored prognosis. By 2016, when the carrier set to sea en route to the Mediterranean, it had to be accompanied by 7 other vessels, including an ocean-going tugboat as a precaution due to potential propulsion failure. It pretty much always goes out with a tugboat, noted Dmitry Gorenberg, a senior research scientist in the Strategy, Policy, Plans and Programs division of the CNA. It's in extremely poor material condition, he added. The pilots are not proficient at all, they don't spend enough time at sea. Another popular military blog at the time put it more succinctly, calling the ship a piece of crap. And, well, they were right. In late 2016, things got pretty dire for the old admiral. Though its carrier air wing had been upgraded with the latest and greatest Russian multi-role aircraft and naval attack helicopters, its latest deployment to the Mediterranean suffered from a shortage of trained pilots, which limited the amount of fixed-wing aircraft it could launch at any given moment. As the carrier group approached the eastern coast of Crete, one of its MiG-29Ks took off from the carrier and returned as planned, only to find the Kuznetsov's deck crews were frantically repairing a broken arresting cable. The carrier commander, with plenty of time to divert the aircraft to a nearby airbase, dithered in the hopes his crew could fix the problem in time. Well, they couldn't. While circling the carrier, the plane ran out of fuel, forcing the pilot to eject into the sea. 2 weeks later, the Kuznetsov participated in its first ever combat operations, launching a series of Su-33 strikes against ISIS in Syria. The Russian Defense Ministry pointed out that the strikes were responsible for killing at least 30 enemy militants, including top field commanders. But Kuznetsov simply couldn't stay out of the news. A week later, another Su-33 crashed into the sea attempting to land on the carrier. The culprit? That darned arresting cable. It turns out it had been damaged even more than the technicians thought in the latest landing attempt. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. The carrier's air wing was transferred ashore to continue ongoing military operations. Meanwhile, in early 2017, the Russian Defense Ministry announced that the Kuznetsov would cease all operations in Syria, return to Russia, and begin a long-needed modernization program to overhaul its technical systems and extend its service by 25 years. This is where things get even more weird. You see, when ships go into dry dock for extensive upgrades, things are supposed to be safer. The environment is controlled, refittings occur on predictable, tight schedules, and crews have access to all the cranes, tools, and equipment they need to do their job properly in an ideal world. And so the Kuznetsov arrived at PD-50, one of the world's largest floating dry docks located at the 82nd Repair Shipyard in the village of Rosselyukovo, serving Russia's northern fleet based out of the neighboring port of Severomorsk, to have an invasive checkup. In the autumn of 2018, fate, karma, bad luck, or whatever you want to call it, again interrupted the Kuznetsov's regularly scheduled programming when the entire dry dock suddenly convulsed and sank into the sea, collapsing cranes onto the carrier's deck and sending shipyard workers scrambling for their lives. Somewhere along the line, the pump system that controlled the dry dock's buoyancy lost power, flooding its ballast tanks with water far in excess of their maximum point. 4 dock workers were wounded, another went missing. While certain Russian officials claimed the Kuznetsov was undamaged in the incident, other outlets were quick to report that there was now a 5-meter gash in the hull of the ship around the waterline and that the deck was supposedly opened up with intricate machinery exposed when the crane fell on it. Much to the Navy's consternation, the industrial accident looked set to delay the Kuznetsov's refit longer than anticipated. And then, a year later, in 2019, the ship caught fire again. Though Russia no longer possessed a dry dock large enough to accommodate a vessel of that size after the sinking of PD-50, it had stubbornly pressed on with the tortured refit when a fire broke out during repairs to the first power unit, sending a thick plume of black smoke into the sky as burning diesel fuel and power cables caused a thick cloud of acrid black smoke to fill the ship's cramped corridors and increased the engulfed area 6-fold to 120 square meters. This estimate made by the Russian TASS news outlet was said to be well short of the mark. Other agencies posited that the blaze covered up to 600 square meters. 8 repairmen had to be rescued from the inferno, 1 remained unaccounted for. Most blame the fire on safety violations. It would be par for the course. The fire damage cost an estimated $8 million, although some sources cite that number may be higher. The Kuznetsov by this point had already become the brunt of international jokes in the press and military circles. Its embarrassing overhaul was only adding insult to injury. Repairs were delayed through 2021, with Russian officials citing bad weather as the chief cause. Okay, it took until May 2022 to return the ship to a new dry dock built in Murmansk after the sinking of the PD-50. When it finally drained in July 2022, repairs continued in earnest. That is until December 2022, when the ship caught fire again. In Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a man at sea inexplicably shoots an enormous seabird that had been flying alongside his vessel for several days. As the bird died, the wind immediately ceased blowing. Irate with the mariner and fully convinced the bird had magically made the wind blow, his crew made him wear the albatross around his neck until it rotted, a heavy burden that acted as a constant reminder of his senseless decision. By this point in the Admiral Kuznetsov's long life, an honest reading of the past 30 years would seem to indicate that the vessel, much like the mariner's albatross, is an unnecessary burden around Russia's neck. Russia seems to be blithely ignoring the chronic shortcomings, tragic losses, and damaged prestige incurred by the vessel's poor design. They remained committed to getting the ship operational sometime in 2023. Now things are looking as bad as ever, as the ship, like the Albatross, seems to be decomposing at the 35th Ship Repair Plant in Murmansk. A recent Defense Intelligence report indicated that even at this late stage of its refitting, the ship could not relocate from the dry dock to one of the repair plant's piers under its own power, but that it still had to be pulled by a series of several tugs. They tried and failed to move the hulking steel mass, owing to the critical condition of the ship's hull. Examinations to the hull revealed that the metal structures below the third deck of the ship were significantly corroded. The holds are filled with muddy water, which makes it impossible to examine the ship in detail from the inside. Today, repairmen are warning the Russian military to deploy the Kuznetsov at their own risk. Its condition, they argue, leaves it with a high probability that it would sink or capsize. Russian naval officials, repairmen, and defense contractors are now hurling blame at one another for the vessel's dismal bill of health. Now nobody knows whether the Kuznetsov will be able to return to service in 2024 or not. This all begs the question, if it's more trouble than it's worth, why doesn't Russia simply scuttle the ship? It all goes back to the way Russia hopes the world perceives it as a global and not a regional naval power. For decades, Russia has been in the process of modernizing its surface fleet with larger numbers of smaller, technologically advanced vessels. Yet it has doggedly clung to many of its older, larger units, vestiges of the Soviet era when it was truly on the brink of becoming a major sea power. Just as Ukraine's sinking of the Moskva in April 2022 was viewed globally as an attack on Russia's perception of itself as a sea power, one expert has observed that scrapping the Kuznetsov would be akin to scrapping the idea of Russia being a great sea power. This, put simply, is just not on the cards for Russia's current cast of leaders. Today, Russia can't afford to build any new large warships of consequence. Until it achieves its long-term strategic goals in Ukraine, this trend looks set to continue for the foreseeable future. In the interim, the Russian Navy will be forced to maintain and modernize its current fleet, so even though its lone carrier is prone to spontaneous combustion, puts its crew in undue danger, remains reliant on external tugs for propulsion, and occasionally forces its pilots to eject at sea, it is and will remain the golden child of the Russian fleet until its leaders see the writing on the wall. Now go and check out why all Russian weapons are a failure, or click this other video instead. Throughout the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflict, neither side has managed to exert air superiority. Despite Russia's larger fleet, Ukraine's clever use of air and anti-air defenses, supercharged by NATO-supplied weapons, has kept Russian planes at bay. But the game could change. Late in 2023, the US made a pivotal move by agreeing to send F-16s to Ukraine, making a first in Ukrainian aviation history. Could these jets tip the scales, offering Ukraine a chance to claim the skies? The F-16, though not the newest kid on the block, is no slouch. As a versatile, late fourth-generation fighter, it's not just about achieving air superiority, it's about providing a flexible option for both attack and defense. Thanks to its all-round capabilities, the F-16 has secured its spot as a mainstay in the fleets of numerous countries and stands as a pillar among NATO forces, outpacing older Soviet and Chinese models. Could the introduction of the F-16s into Ukraine's arsenal rewrite the aerial warfare playbook? Let's explore what these jets bring to the high-stakes aerial duel. When it comes to the supposed efficiency of the F-16s, it's important to compare them to the powerhouse of the Russian and Ukrainian air forces, the Su-27. From a technical standpoint, both F-16s and Su-27s belong to the fourth generation of combat aircraft, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. The Su-27 was designed to be an air-to-air dogfighting and air superiority aircraft. It's fast and efficient at taking out enemy air forces. With a top airspeed of about 160 miles per hour more than the F-16, an Su-27 can outmaneuver other similar aircraft in close-range combat. Keep in mind that the Su-27s that Russia and Ukraine use are technically not the same aircraft. Both Russia and Ukraine inherited their fleets of Su-27s from the Soviet era, yet Russia has since enhanced its aircraft with significant upgrades. Moreover, Russia's arsenal includes the advanced Su-35s, giving it a broader range of modern aerial capabilities. Despite these challenges, Ukraine has shown resilience and adaptability with its available Soviet-era aircraft. In 2022, Ukraine faced tough losses, with 62 aircraft down during combat missions. Given that Ukraine's Air Force comprises about 80 fourth-generation MiG-29 and Su-27s, these losses impacted the number of operations conducted in 2023. Remarkably, the losses were reduced to 7 aircraft in that year, underscoring the Air Force's strategic adjustments and efforts to preserve its fleet. This reduction in losses highlights Ukraine's capability to adapt and continue its aerial defense efforts despite having lost approximately 40% of its air power. Ukraine's Air Force relies on its existing fleet and international support as the country does not currently produce new aircraft. This reliance on older models and the challenge of securing spare parts for maintenance are significant hurdles. However, the potential integration of Western aircraft like the F-16 into Ukraine's arsenal could open new avenues for enhancing its aerial capabilities, offering hope for bolstering Ukraine's defensive and offensive air strategies. Still, the reliance on already obsolete aircraft has turned the Russo-Ukrainian battle into a prolonged war of attrition. In light of the heavy losses accrued during 2022, Ukrainian tactics have shifted from aerial attacks on Russian soil to mid-range operations to take out key pieces of the Russian army infrastructure and command. The tactic is bolstered by the fact that Ukraine has already received plenty of ground-to-air missiles and weaponry, allowing its army to support air operations with anti-air defenses. Ukrainian aircraft therefore can launch a hit-and-run attack on Russian forces and duck behind the heavy Ukrainian air defenses, making the operations less likely to result in the loss of aircraft. But this air battle isn't straightforward. Russia does possess a bigger fleet with around 100 Su-27s and an additional 130 of the more advanced Su-35s, and Russian radars spotting targets from 100 miles away outrange Ukraine's 55-mile reach, letting them spot and counter threats, including drones and missiles, sooner. Their R-77 missiles can hit targets from 80 miles out, a capability Ukraine lacks, putting Ukrainian jets at risk before they even know what hit them. But despite these advantages, the fight for air dominance remains at a deadlock. Russia doesn't have enough concentrated long-range capabilities to take out NATO-provided air defenses. Similarly, Ukrainian planes don't have the range to reach further out from the same defenses and strike key Russian infrastructure and military hardware to make a meaningful advance. That's where the F-16 aims to completely overturn the tide of battle. F-16s have a more powerful radar system, which has a range of over 110 miles in its most potent version. This gives the jet a significant edge over Russia's improved Su-27s in target acquisition and tactics. Additionally, getting F-16s also means that Ukraine will gain access to modern missiles that are compatible with the plane's mechanisms. Most notably, this includes the AIM-120 AMRAAM, which is one of the most versatile and destructive missiles in active use. AIM-120s have a range of 65 to 100 miles and have gained a fearsome reputation due to their use in various wars during the 21st century. It's one of the hallmarks of America's ongoing air supremacy, and its capability to lock onto and track a target fills a hole in Ukraine's arsenal. The missiles easily outgun Russia's R-77s, which will allow Ukraine to penetrate deeper into occupied territory or Crimea and even strike at targets on the Russian mainland. The active radar system inside the R-77s and AIM-120s also means pilots won't have to maintain a lock onto their targets. The system slots perfectly into Ukraine's existing hit-and-run tactics, meaning that pilots can combine their experience with modernized ordnance and planes to gain an advantage. Giving Ukraine F-16s and AIM-120s will provide stability against Russia and maintain control over its airspace. One of the key factors that makes F-16s considerably more powerful than their Soviet counterparts is their general reliability. F-16s have an expected lifespan of between 3,500 and 4,500 flight hours. Accordingly, their components are generally expected to last for that period, and the airplane can remain in service with minor repairs and maintenance. After that, the mechanical parts have a much higher chance of breaking down due to wear and tear, and the wiring might fray and damage important electrical components. By contrast, older Soviet MiGs and Sukhois only have an expected lifespan in the range of 2,000 to 3,500 hours. Similarly to how Ukraine had to reduce flight operations between 2022 and 23 to counter airplane loss, Russia has also had to moderate its Air Force use. The oldest aircraft that Russia has used, MiG-29s and Su-27s, are much closer to the end of their lifespan. Furthermore, since Russia needs to mount an offensive, its planes typically have to fly in from farther bases, making each operation more demanding on Russian aircraft than Ukrainian aircraft. In fact, the prolonged nature of the war between Russia and Ukraine has also brought about a major concept in maintaining air superiority called imputed losses. The concept refers to the fact that the military will lose some of its key equipment or weaponry not due to enemy fire, but to parts breaking down from wear and tear. According to estimates by the RAND Corporation, Russia has lost between 30 and 60 aircraft solely to imputed losses over the last 2 years. If we take the average value, around 45 planes have been grounded because their parts can no longer operate. Russia has needed to fly their planes more frequently and push them to their limits, but it doesn't have enough manufacturing capacity to offset those losses. Based on RAND's report, Russia can produce between 18 and 36 modern aircraft per year, and it's assumed that it will need to cut down its Air Force operating capacity further to maintain its existing fleet. Since the country is still midway through replacing old Soviet-era planes with Su-35s, it's possible that they will prioritize using Su-27s. The main reason being that it will become prohibitively expensive to maintain a fleet of Su-27s. Russia might consider putting them up as sacrificial lambs in combat to allow more modern aircraft a better chance of survival. This means that Ukraine is more likely to see Su-27s and other fourth-generation aircraft used against them over the course of the war. With many reports suggesting that Russia doesn't have a concrete plan of pushing into Ukraine for the rest of 2024, it's possible that this would be Ukraine's time to push back on Russia's encroachment into their airspace. And that's where the newly donated F-16s could prove pivotal. These planes are coming from Denmark, around 25 aircraft, and the Netherlands, roughly 52 aircraft. The planes are likely relatively well preserved since the countries involved haven't needed to use their air force to a great extent over the past 20 years. With F-16s being a more competitive aircraft model, Russia will have no choice but to activate more of its air force to compensate. This will lead to further use of both modern and obsolete aircraft in the VKS, the Russian Aerospace Forces, increasing how often they perform sorties to counteract the F-16's improved radar detection and targeting range and avoid infrastructural losses. As a result, the increased aircraft usage will compound the imputed losses that the force will suffer throughout the war. Therefore, Russia might actively lose whatever advantage it has managed to hold on to for the last 2 years. Ukraine might even be able to take back contested areas, or at least manage to maintain air superiority over them. This will allow them to mount a concerted counter-offensive should the Russians ever falter on any front. Finally, if F-16s give Ukraine control over its airspace, they can be used to make offensive strikes deeper into Russian territory, taking out key artillery pieces that make ground combat more favorable for the Ukrainian forces. These victories in Ukrainian airspace could also prove fantastic for improving morale in the Ukrainian army. The soldiers have already managed to stave off the invasion with incredibly limited access to newer technology and being heavily outnumbered. With the addition of more advanced and reliable aircraft, they could push the Russians further out of Ukraine. But if the F-16s would have made so much difference for the Ukrainian forces, why have deliveries only started in late 2023? The answer to that hinges on the volatile state of global geopolitics. Over the past few years, Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has issued statements suggesting that the US delivering F-16s to Ukraine would be seen as a direct threat to Russia. This stems from the fact that F-16s technically have the capacity to carry nuclear warheads instead of traditional missiles, at least according to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Some have speculated that Russia will be willing to push the nuclear button on what it perceives to be grave transgressions against the country's efforts in Eastern Europe. This could plunge the entire world into a war, with many sides accruing significant losses as nuclear weapons are dispatched by all countries who own them. It should be noted that this is a similar strategy Putin has exercised in the past, even at the beginning of the invasion after it was clear that Ukraine wouldn't fall in 10 days. However, if the US took a chance and gave Ukraine F-16s at the start of the 2022 conflict, there's no telling whether Russia would follow through with that threat. But in recent years, Russia has pretty much exhausted its diplomatic options. With the Western countries becoming independent from Russia's oil and gas, Putin was forced to turn to China and India and other smaller trading partners to compensate for the income loss. However, that means that Russia has lost the upper hand in many negotiations and is currently positioning itself as a minor trading partner for China. As a result, leaders in the US and NATO were likely considering that the threats from Russia were empty and decided that they wouldn't lose too much if they donated F-16s to Ukraine. Additionally, Russia's repeated attacks on civilian infrastructure has seen an increase in public support for Ukraine and may have encouraged the US to act faster to help shorten the war. The versatility of F-16s to carry both air-to-ground and air-to-air missiles means that they can be used to take down enemy drones and ordnance conducting strikes on civilian targets. Russia's situation is further complicated by the fact that its main ally throughout this war, China, seems to have gone silent on the matter. Considering China's goals to reduce American influence in the Indo-Pacific, it may be preparing to go to war with either the US or Russia to expand its claims and obtain more resources. That puts Russia in a hard situation where they won't have the backing of the world's second superpower should they make an impulsive decision. With the arrival of the F-16s, Ukraine will get a sizable boost in firepower. This comes in the form of advanced missile guidance systems that the planes can carry. While Ukraine already has access to some of the latest missiles available, such as the Storm Shadows, their capabilities were stunted by the fact that the MiG-29 and Su-27 weren't native platforms that can carry and guide them. The Ukrainian army had to cobble together makeshift carrying systems that could take these missiles into the air and launch them at the enemy. However, their range and accuracy took a hit, and their usefulness as precision strike missiles were largely nullified. With the addition of the F-16s, though, the army can now make full use of advanced weaponry to close the gap between Russia's numerical and technological superiority. Apart from the Storm Shadows, one potential game-changer associated with the F-16 donation is the AGM-88 HARM missile. This is an anti-radar missile that eradicates enemy positioning systems, thereby disabling them from launching long-range precision strikes. With these capabilities in Ukraine's possession, Russia will need to position its key artillery infrastructure closer to the border or withdraw it entirely. Furthermore, this strategic repositioning will also play to Ukraine's advantage. Due to the F-16's longer radar range and long-range capabilities, Ukraine will be able to exert more pressure on Russia's artillery, allowing it to eliminate Russia's long-range support equipment. What the F-16 will also bring to the table is improved mission control and tactical information access. Su-27s still rely on analog interfaces and gauges to display relevant information. However, since each display is limited to one piece or type of data, the cockpit of an Su-27 is loaded with displays and knobs, creating an information overload for the pilot. On the other hand, F-16s have integrated digital display systems. The digital screen allows the pilot to switch between different viewing modes and information panels. Apart from reducing visual clutter, the digital display has a much higher fidelity and responsiveness. All information that a pilot needs to consider at any given time can be accessed with a switch. However, the F-16 isn't the perfect solution for the Ukrainian military just yet. One of the most critical hurdles that need to be overcome is the lack of experienced pilots who can effectively navigate the F-16's modern systems. Since the Ukrainian Airforce so far has had no direct contact with F-16s, its pilots have never been trained on its modules. According to some estimates, it would take between 4 and 6 months to retrain a pilot from an Su-27 to an F-16. This is further complicated by the fact that most Ukrainian soldiers aren't proficient in English. While this might not seem significant, it's important to remember that training manuals and manufacturing manuals are rarely translated into languages as uncommon as Ukrainian, which is spoken as a main language only in Ukraine itself. This means that the US or another NATO country would need to partake in a monumental task of translating all manuals to Ukrainian while ensuring they are consistent and logical. Since this wasn't seen as a priority at the time, another option is to teach Ukrainian pilots English to a sufficient level. Even the few Ukrainian pilots who are proficient in English and can start training immediately need between 2 and 4 months before they would be combat ready. Additionally, F-16s require a different military airport strip setup. Soviet planes from the 20th century were designed to be operated from remote areas with minimal ground control support and short takeoff and landing strips. By contrast, the F-16 has a lengthier takeoff procedure. MiG-29 and Su-27 planes have built-in ruggedness that ensures that the planes can endure adverse takeoff conditions, which the F-16 isn't particularly built for. For example, there have been videos of MiG planes being able to take off from regular civilian roads, something that's pretty much unthinkable for more modern aircraft. As a result, Ukraine will have a much more limited number of military airfields that can be used to field and deploy F-16s from the country. Due to the more elaborate logistical planning and reduced options, Russia might have an easier time spotting and monitoring airstrips that are used to deploy F-16s into the fray. To reduce the risks, Ukraine's best option is to field its F-16s in the western portions of the country, which are the furthest from the Russian front. However, this reduces the effective range of the jets, which would reduce their combat prowess. This is further compounded by the fact that F-16s actually have a lower travel range than Su-27s. While their fuel tanks are almost 4 times larger, the newer airplane chugs through fuel much quicker. A purely defensive position on the opposite side from the front would be economically inefficient, making the Ukrainian army much more reliant on fuel import than usual. Finally, F-16s are much more difficult to maintain than older Soviet aircraft. According to some estimates, the Su-27 requires 11 hours of maintenance for each flight hour, while an F-16 needs 17 hours for the same flight time. Additionally, Ukraine will be hard-pressed to adequately train its ground crews to maintain the craft. NATO countries can contract out ground crews, but that still poses a risk of having foreign civilians in a warring country. Regardless of the challenges involved in the process of integrating F-16s into the Ukrainian Air Force, the West remains cautious about donating these aircraft. While a big reason for that is the general unwillingness to let the war prolong even further, Western countries are also heavily incentivized to do so. The F-16s donated to Ukraine won't be brand new aircraft just out of the factories. All planes going to Ukraine will be older vehicles that haven't seen much combat and real use, but that are becoming obsolete and replaced with newer designs. By donating the F-16s to Ukraine, NATO countries can offload the cost of decommissioning the airplanes and their surrounding equipment and support. It might not seem like much, but removing a jet from active duty requires a significant logistical effort, which takes time and money to implement. By offloading those planes to Ukraine, the US, Denmark, and the Netherlands can save some of that money and provide much-needed political and military support to the country. It also showcases to the world that the West stays united with Ukraine in their fight against Russia. Despite these challenges, the F-16s should start seeing active use in Ukraine by the second quarter of 2024, with delivery orders being fulfilled until 2025 if the war continues. While Russia remains undeterred by the progress of Ukrainian aerial forces, Ukraine is well on its way to implementing training programs to use the aircraft to their fullest. With this injection of firepower, Ukraine will gain renewed hope of prolonging and turning the tide of the war. While the bulk of Russia's air supremacy comes from a larger fleet, F-16s will allow Ukraine to get up to speed technologically with the modernized Su-27s and even be able to go toe-to-toe with the Su-35s. And even though the F-16s are by now considered obsolete compared to the modern F-35s, they can still have a few final hurrahs in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Despite the fact Ukraine might not be able to field them for another few months, the army has shown considerable enthusiasm into making full use of these aircraft. With that, the F-16 will be remembered as another high point in the history of 20th century military aircraft design. How do you think the fight between Ukraine's F-16s and Russia's Su-27s and Su-35s will play out? Will the aircraft be enough to give Ukraine a better fighting chance, or do you think it's a case of too little, too late, and that the jets should have been deployed at the start of the conflict? Let us know in the comment section. Now go and check out how the F-35 could achieve air dominance in Ukraine within 24 hours. Or click this other video instead. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky has cut an increasingly desperate figure in recent months. The war with Russia has entered its third calendar year. The crucial city of Avdiivka has just fallen into enemy hands. A vital new military aid package from the US has been delayed in Congress. At no time in the conflict has the situation looked bleaker for the beleaguered Ukrainian people. In a report in the UK's Guardian newspaper from February 20th, Zelensky is quoted as saying that the situation is extremely difficult, an understatement or a tacit admission of defeat. Whichever way you interpret his words, the war looks to be slipping out of Kyiv's hands. But what if there was one piece of serious military hardware that could not only give Ukraine the edge over Russia, but do so within 24 hours? Pie in the sky? Wishful thinking? Maybe not. Enter the F-35 Lightning II fighter jet. But what's so special about this particular aircraft, and why could it play such a decisive and swift role in the conflict? According to Lockheed Martin, an American aerospace arms and defense corporation, the F-35 is the centerpiece of 21st century global security. The pilots who've flown the jet wholeheartedly agree. According to a report in Business Insider, Billy Flynn, a former Canadian lieutenant colonel and senior F-35 test pilot, told The Aviationist in April 2023 that the jet could play a key role in the conflict. The F-35 was designed precisely for an environment that we are seeing in Ukraine now. Principally funded by the US, the F-35 first flew in 2006 and entered full military service with the US Marine Corps in July 2015. But in terms of actual combat, the jet was first used in 2018 by the Israeli Air Force. To give you an idea of how highly the F-35 is regarded, the US plans to buy 2,456 jets by 2044. This will constitute the bulk of the crewed tactical aviation of the US Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps for several decades. Additionally, the aircraft will be a cornerstone of NATO and US allied air power and operate until 2070. It could easily be classed as the most sophisticated fighter jet in the world. Add 10+ years of combat experience into the mix and you'll get an even better idea of the difference it could make in the war in Ukraine. But perhaps the F-35's most potent ability is being able to link up and share target data with other ground, naval, and air units, meaning the enemy is facing 5 opponents instead of 1. Even without any upgrades, the F-35 outperforms other fighters in the US fleet. It's been proven to defeat adversary aircraft in exercises by a truly stunning 20-1 margin. Better still, it accomplishes a broader array of tasks, and it's easier to maintain than other fighter jets. By some distance, it's the most reliable tactical aircraft in the Joint Fleet. So the jet most certainly has an impressive pedigree. But what exactly does the F-35 Lightning II bring to the table in terms of combat capabilities, and how could it provide the crucial air dominance Ukraine wants over Russia? A multi-role stealth aircraft, this jet has been designed for air superiority and strike missions. Equipped with a powerful electronic warfare and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance suite, it offers the ultimate in aerial firepower. Just as importantly, the F-35 can gather and distribute real-time battlefield information to friendly forces that we just mentioned. Its weapon capabilities are potentially devastating and incredibly versatile. In a configuration known as Beast Mode, it carries 4 500-pound GBU-12 laser-guided bombs on its wings, 2 GBU-12 in its internal weapons bay, and an AIM-9 air-to-air heat-seeking missile. And while that may mean sacrifices in stealth for firepower, we're still looking at a very dangerous piece of equipment. Moreover, the F-35's ability to enhance the capabilities of friendly aircraft would be invaluable in the conflict in Ukraine. Why? The jet excels in highly contested airspace and would be far more effective than the F-16s that have already been deployed to the area and will be deployed in greater numbers later in the year. Particularly adept against surface-to-air missile systems and other ground defenses, it will easily destroy them and any enemy aircraft to achieve air dominance. How? The aircraft's stealth profile. These capabilities are crucial to the aircraft's effectiveness, never more so than in any potential deployment in Ukraine. The F-35 too was designed for wars where the front lines are contested with surface-to-air missile radars, SAMs. Granted, Russia has powerful SAMs, only they can't be deployed near the front lines. Another tick in the box for the F-35 too. If nothing else, the Ukraine conflict has shown just how vulnerable fourth-generation aircraft are to air defenses that are 40+ years old and even considered antiquated by some armed forces. Russia has been deploying SAMs in Belarus, Crimea, as well as in the Donbass and Kherson region, effectively covering large parts of Ukrainian airspace. For that reason, Ukrainian pilots have been restricted to flying over grasslands, highways, and treetops throughout the conflict to avoid detection. That's why the F-35 would be so effective in not just heading a bombing campaign from the outset, but also routine air-to-air and air-ground sorties. The bottom line, the aircraft can strike wherever and whenever needed. The result, air dominance, maybe within as little as 24 hours. Make no mistake, air dominance is one thing, but the F-35 would also be crucial in helping Ukrainian forces regain lost territories and ultimately banish the Russians from their soil once and for all. For many, however, the ace up the sleeve for the F-35 is in terms of pure kinematics. In attrition warfare, where each aircraft has a clear view of the other, it's simply a matter of whoever launches the missile first will win the battle. In a low observable F-35, however, the aircraft wouldn't be seen by the enemy fighter jet. Therefore, the pilot can shoot a missile before the adversary is aware of its existence. For that reason, it would eliminate the need to play the kind of kinematic tactics that have been a part of aerial combat through all the years of 3rd generation and 4th generation weapons and fighters. So how would the F-35 fare against its Russian counterpart, the Su-30? While both are advanced fighter jets, the F-35 is more designed for air-to-air and air-to-ground combat. In comparison, the Su-30 is a highly maneuverable and agile 4th generation fighter, designed to be in dogfights, close-run engagements, with ultimate deployment and strategy perhaps being the deciding factor, but we'll discuss the more tactical side of Russia's Air Force plan later in the video. And there's more. Once air dominance is achieved, backup aircraft like the F-16 could provide additional firepower against ground troops, with the all-singing and all-dancing F-35 patrolling the skies to protect them. Potentially, it could have played a decisive role in the battle for Avdiivka. With aerial support of this magnitude, the key town in the Donbass region would likely not have fallen into Russian hands. Theoretically, therefore, as few as 4 F-35s could provide air superiority over a limited area, such as the skies in Ukraine. In a report in Air and Space Forces magazine, Air Force General Todd D. Walters, who also serves as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, concurred with that theory. He said that getting more F-35s to Europe, either as part of the US Air Force or for other nations, is critical. More specifically, he claimed, they'll deliver a tremendous improvement in strategic ability, in indications and warnings, command and control, and mission command. Now, all of this might sound incredible. If Zelensky's allies want to bring an end to the war as quickly as possible, then the F-35 too has the tools to do the job. But wars are never straightforward affairs to conduct, and most importantly to finance. By the same token, it's in nobody's interest for the conflict to drag on and on into 2025 and beyond. With that in mind, what is the likelihood of Ukraine receiving the 4 F-35s it needs to achieve dominance over its own airspace? The answer to that question is complex, manifold, and ultimately out of Zelensky's hands. But perhaps the most pertinent factor to consider is how much one of these miracle fighter jets actually costs. Well, if you were shopping for just a single F-35 Lightning II, it would set you back around the $109 million mark. But you would get plenty of choice and bang for your buck. There are 3 options with different operating abilities available: conventional takeoff and landing, F-35A, short takeoff and vertical landing, F-35B, and a variant designed for aircraft carrier operations, F-35C. But of course, there is so much more to fighter jet deployment than just the cost of one aircraft. According to Simply Flying, the overall project cost of the F-35 program has increased from an initial $200 billion to over $400 billion, with an estimated lifetime cost of $1.7 trillion. And this perhaps brings us to the crux of the issue. Since the invasion in February 2022, Ukraine has received huge military aid packages from the West. According to a CNN report, that figure is around $350 billion. According to stats from the New York Times, the European Union collectively has provided about $148.5 billion in assistance since Russia launched its full-scale invasion. Crazy, mind-boggling numbers. But even with the best will in the world and the greatest of intentions, financial support of that kind can't go on forever. No matter how big or powerful a nation or collective of nations, their coffers are not a bottomless pit. Hence the wrangling in the US Congress we touched upon at the top of the video. So that very much leaves Ukraine's Western allies with a risk and reward scenario to weigh up. Go all in with Zelensky and supply him with F-35s, or supply less effective hardware and watch the conflict drag on. Encouragingly, they can look to the start of the conflict. Before a single shell was fired, Western officials predicted that Russia would enjoy the kind of air supremacy it enjoyed in the large-scale airstrikes in the Syrian war. But failure on the first day of the Russians to destroy the Ukrainian air defense facilities has hampered Moscow's invasion strategy, a senior Western intelligence official told The Times. In terms of numbers, it didn't make pretty reading for the Ukrainians. At the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine was believed to have around 120 combat-capable aircraft, mainly consisting of aging Soviet-era MiG-29s and Su-27s. To match Moscow's firepower, which is thought to be 5 to 6 times greater than Kyiv's, they needed up to 200 jets. Without a doubt, the battle for the skies has been one of the more curious and certainly most crucial subplots of the war. According to a CNN report from 2022, the Russian Air Force had a massive advantage in terms of overall hardware. To give you a more detailed breakdown, Russia's 1,391 aircraft to Ukraine's 132, complemented by 948 helicopters to Kyiv's 55. was capable of the kind of aerial dominance required to end Ukraine's resistance. But for whatever reason, botched Russian tactics being the most popular and persuasive explanation, it simply didn't happen. It's also worth noting that Russia's overall defense budget of $45.8 billion is almost 10 times that of its neighbor. There's more. Russia had roughly 300 military aircraft stationed around the borders of the country, but has used few in the invasion so far. Instead, Russia has used attack helicopters and some short-range fighters, but made very limited use of long-range attack aircraft and bombers. Why is a question that has beguiled many military experts. One reason may be that Russia is not confident they destroyed Ukraine's air defenses and are not confident they can send fighters overhead without losing them, said another senior military figure. Given the F-35's undoubted capabilities, coupled with its suitability for this kind of conflict, air dominance could perhaps be achieved in Ukraine with relative ease. So, are financial constraints the main thing working against Zelensky then? To answer that question, we need to look at the bigger picture. Logistically, supplying the Ukraine with fighter jets isn't the most straightforward of processes. Why? Training. It's believed that Ukraine has 50 pilots who could start training them on Western jets immediately. However, preparing them to fly warplanes takes time. Just as importantly, it removes them from current fighting duties. And with the fall of such a crucial and symbolically important city as Avdiivka, Zelensky would be very reluctant to withdraw experienced fighters from the front line. To address this issue, the British government has offered to train Ukrainian pilots on NATO standard aircraft. This comes with a depressing caveat, however, as it's clearly a longer-term option. Training pilots could take months or even years, especially considering the complexity of the modern fighter jet. But encouragingly, British officials think the training process could be ramped up for some of Ukraine's more seasoned pilots with years of experience flying Soviet-era jet planes. Not the greatest news for Zelensky, but not a disaster by any means. However, the training issue also rears its ugly head in terms of maintenance. To keep a jet like the F-35-2 airborne requires complex and specialized engineering. Dr. Jamie Scheer, formerly of NATO, told the BBC that fifth-generation fighter jets require extensive maintenance following almost every flight. Again, Ukraine just doesn't have the personnel on the ground with the kind of experience needed to keep their prospective F-35s in the air. Again, it's important to note that air superiority isn't just about the number of aircraft you have in the skies. It also involves a variety of factors such as tactics and support systems. Invariably, military operations are complex and dynamic, and it's impossible to predict the outcome of any engagement with certainty. Once again, you need experienced people on the ground coordinating your aerial attacks, not just maintaining your hardware. Essential considerations that will not have been overlooked by Zelensky's allies. When multi-million-dollar aircraft are involved, decisions need to be weighed carefully. But it must be stated, the F-35 isn't the only fighter jet in the world that could assist the Ukrainian war effort against the Russian aggressors. At the time of writing for this video, Ukraine is due to receive a significant shipment of F-16 fighters from the West in the spring. Yuri Anat, the spokesperson of the Airforce Command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, estimated that the country needed between 100 and 200 jets to defend its airspace. According to a report in the New York Times from back in August of 2023, the Netherlands and Denmark joined the US in pledging to donate some jets to the Ukrainian cause, all of which prompted Zelensky to post on messaging app Telegram a breakthrough agreement. From today, there are already specifics. They will be in the Ukrainian sky, thank you. Even so, there are deeper divisions and retinence that have opened up since Putin's invasion. Not just in the United States, but throughout the Western world, there is an increasing sense of war weariness. Even those who passionately supported Zelensky during the first few months of the conflict look to have had a change of heart. Gradually, people have started to realize that the massive military aid packages that their governments are providing are doing nothing more than prolonging the conflict. Citizens are tired of turning on their televisions and seeing bombed-out shells of buildings and dead bodies piled up in the streets. A catch-22 situation, if ever there was one. If enough people think that doing the right thing is having the wrong outcome, it puts yet another obstacle in Zelensky's path. All of which begs the question, what next? Some experts have advocated a negotiated peace settlement. In a report obtained by Newsweek, there have been calls for the US to play a more significant role in facilitating the process. The paper, published by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, disputes the idea that diplomacy is entirely untenable. However, that claim does have a chilling caveat. The authors believe that the view that a negotiated end to the war in Ukraine is neither possible nor desirable is false. It's also extremely dangerous for Ukraine's future. The war is not trending toward a stable stalemate, but toward Ukraine's eventual collapse. But if the whispering coming out of Moscow, or more correctly, the bullish posturing Putin displayed in his interview with Tucker Carlson, are to be believed, any peace deal would be so heavily loaded in Russia's favor, Zelensky would never put pen to paper in a million years. A more likely scenario is continued hostilities and further loss of life, even if 2024 is more of a year of consolidation for both sides rather than all-out offensives. Who would be happier with that outcome is obvious. With the fall of Avdiivka and 20% of Ukrainian territory in his back pocket, Putin looks happy to play the long game. Wait and see what Zelensky and the West come up with next. The battle of air dominance was thought to be a key factor in the war itself, and while that hasn't quite happened as yet, there is no doubt that the introduction of a fighter jet like the F-35 would make Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin very nervous indeed. Ultimately, such an aircraft could make all the difference in Ukraine's war with Russia. With its advanced electronic warfare and intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance suite, it would give them the upper hand in the air and essential support for ground troops. In terms of aerial firepower, we've already talked about its 4 500-pound GBU-12 laser-guided bombs on its wings, the 2 GBU-12 in its internal weapons bay, and the AIM-9 air-to-air heat-seeking missile. And the ability to gather and distribute real-time battlefield information to friendly forces would enable troops to coordinate decisive offensives and counter-offensives far more effectively. But all of this must be tempered with a solid dose of military and economic reality. History teaches us that it's not always the biggest or best-equipped army that wins the war. The will and determination of the people embroiled in the conflict have often proven to be the determining factor. But as mentioned, perhaps the biggest conundrum facing the West is whether prolonging the war will not only be counterproductive to their collective goals, but come at too much of a cost in terms of human life. Granted, it is well within Biden's and all the other Western leaders' capabilities to supply Ukraine with enough F-35 jets to gain air dominance over Russia in a super quick time. But will it bring a swift end to the conflict? Now we're coming to the end of the video, it's time to ask you what you think about the current situation in Ukraine. Do you think the deployment of the F-35 Lightning II could help Ukraine deal a fatal blow to Russia? Would establishing air dominance be a crucial factor in the outcome of the war? And if that's the case, would it make sense for NATO, the US, and the rest of Zelensky's allies to act now in an attempt to put a swift end to the conflict? Or are you on the other side of the fence? Taking into account Biden's reluctance to supply Ukraine with fighter jets 2 years ago, is there any realistic chance of Ukraine being supplied with state-of-the-art military hardware now? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis from military experts. According to the Oryx blog, as of February 1st, 2024, Russia has lost 2,678 tanks during its invasion of Ukraine. Of these, 1,753 have been destroyed, making for a destruction rate of 65.4%. The total tank losses account for 21.4% of Russia's pre-war tank fleet of about 12,500 units. To make matters worse for the Kremlin, the Oryx numbers account for only the visually confirmed losses. The true number of Russian tank casualties is likely higher, in everything from the stalled convoys outside of Kyiv at the start of the war to the frequent jack-in-the-box explosions of Russian tank turrets. Putin's depleted tank force has become a meme. This meme has reinforced the opinion of some war watchers that the tank has become obsolete on the modern battlefield as a result of improved man-portable anti-tank weapons like the NLAW and Javelin, the rise of precision-guided artillery, and perhaps most importantly, the ascendancy of drones to being one of the centerpieces of warfare. However, the death of the tank is an overstated idea. Tanks remain useful in many important battlefield functions. Russia is just using its tanks improperly. In this video, we will look at how Russia has mismanaged its armored forces and the deep doctrinal origins of the tank tactics that have proven so ruinous on the battlefields of Ukraine. It is true that Russian tanks suffer from serious design flaws. The most common tank in the Russian fleet, the T-72, has some admirable qualities. Despite these flaws, it's cheap and easy to produce with a powerful 125mm smoothbore gun. However, this tank was not designed to fight in wars of the type Ukraine has evolved into. Also, the tank's ammunition is not sealed away from the crew compartment. Instead, the ammunition is stored under the crew and loaded by the T-72's autoloader. As modern man-portable anti-tank weapons target the thinly armored turret of an enemy tank, and kamikaze drones can easily dive down on such turrets as well, the results have often been a chain reaction that destroys the entire ammunition magazine, leading to the jack-in-the-box explosions that totaled the tank and its crew. The T-80 and T-90, which are ultimately based on the T-72, suffer from the same structural vulnerabilities. However, this weakness alone does not explain why Russia has lost so many tanks in Ukraine. It's also true that the Russians have simply failed to adequately support their armored units. Namely, the Russians do not have a cohesive combined arms approach to warfare. A United States Army manual from 2012 called ADRP 3.0 Unified Land Operations has a good definition of the combined arms doctrine. Combined arms is the synchronized and simultaneous application of arms to achieve an effect greater than if each arm was used separately or sequentially. Combined arms integrates leadership, information, and each of the warfighting functions and their supporting systems. Used destructively, combined arms integrates different capabilities so that counteracting one makes the enemy vulnerable to another. Used constructively, combined arms multiplies the effectiveness and efficiency of army capabilities used in stability or defense support of civil authorities. Combined arms uses the capabilities of each warfighting function and information in complementary and reinforcing capabilities. Complementary capabilities protect the weaknesses of one system or organization with the capabilities of a different warfighting function. For example, commanders use artillery fires to suppress an enemy bunker complex, pinning down an infantry unit, movement and maneuver. The infantry unit then closes with and destroys the enemy. In this example, the fire's warfighting function complements the movement and maneuver warfighting function. Although the combined arms doctrine might sound modern, it has its origins in ancient warfare. One of the more famous examples would be the Macedonian army under Philip II and his son, Alexander the Great. Like the Greeks centuries before them, these two Macedonian monarchs used the phalanx infantry formation as their army's main arm, but combined it with missile units, light infantry, and heavy cavalry. Archers and slingers would disrupt enemy formations, the phalanx would move into position to hold them in place, and heavy cavalry would deliver a smashing hammer blow from the flanks or rear, with the light infantry acting as reserve units that could be rapidly deployed as needed. In more modern times, it took a combined arms approach of well-used artillery for fire support, infantry for maneuver, and tanks for forward momentum, together under cover of air support to break the deadlock of trench warfare in World War I. Prior to this, these arms were often used separately or improperly or inadequately supported, leading to 4 bloody years of the trenches. For the United States, the lessons of combined arms warfare were reinforced during Operation Iraqi Freedom and the bitter counterinsurgency campaign that followed. Tanks proved vulnerable if they were unsupported, especially in the urban settings where the fighting concentrated. Proper infantry support was needed to maneuver toward hidden nests of enemy resistance, especially in the presence of civilians, which dictated a need for the type of accurate armored or fire support that only infantry could determine in order to prevent non-combatant casualties. Russia, on the other hand, has a doctrine that shies away from a combined arms approach to warfare, and instead heavily emphasizes artillery and tanks. The origin of this approach comes with the Soviet Union's deep battle doctrine, which was first developed in the 1920s and 30s. The deep battle idea was the Soviet Union's attempt to create a middle ground between the tactical and strategic levels of warfare, the operational art, in other words. Deep battle had one overarching objective: to keep things moving on the battlefield. At all costs, the Soviet brass wanted to avoid a repetition of the trench drudgery seen in World War I. The Soviets therefore envisioned waves of tanks smashing through narrow and vulnerable portions of the enemy front line. Wave upon wave of tanks and then infantry, supported by artillery, would pour in on the same axis and be ready to deploy in repeat operations. Stalin's purges of most of the Soviet military's best officers in the 1930s meant that the doctrine saw delays in implementation, but when it did get employed, it proved highly successful. The Nazi war machine was never able to develop a true answer for it. The Red Army bore the vast majority of the brunt of the fighting against the Nazis on land during the Second World War, and its success against Hitler solidified the notion of deep battle into Soviet and later Russian military thinking. However, there was a big flaw to deep battle. It was costly, inflicting enormous casualties on friend and foe alike. In fact, the Soviet Union suffered far more casualties than Nazi Germany did in the conflict, and although much of this was due to the Nazis striking at a time of high Russian vulnerability in 1941 and 42, not all of it was. Even in 1944, the Soviet Union suffered battlefield losses of 5 million to Nazi Germany's 1.1 million, according to Colonel Trevor N. Dupuy in his Numbers, Predictions, and War. The Soviet Union could afford to take such lopsided casualties because of its overwhelming advantage in numbers and material, and because its Western allies gradually destroyed German industry through air raids. But the Red Army's wartime performance revealed a serious flaw in the deep battle doctrine. Unless you broke through quickly, you were simply sending more and more units into the deeply entrenched defensive positions, which was, in effect, asking for a repeat of the Soviet Union's miserable experience in the Winter War against Finland between 1939 and 1940. Operation Mars in 1942 showed what could happen if deep battle failed. Often called Zhukov's greatest defeat, this attack centered on the town of Rzhev against experienced German troops entrenched in well-defended positions with adequate panzer support. The Soviet Union lost about 200,000 men, and perhaps two-thirds of the tanks it employed in the battle, in exchange for 40,000 German casualties. The Soviets failed to dislodge the German defenders from their fortified positions. Operation Mars is little known today. Perhaps if the Kremlin remembered its lessons more, it could have avoided taking such heavy armored losses in the current war. In Ukraine, the Russians have fought with something that resembles deep battle doctrine, with similar tactics and consequences should things go wrong for the Russian armed forces. In the war's first year, Moscow preferred to use its artillery in World War II-style saturation fire. However, a shortage of ammunition has since forced the Russian army to be more selective in its target selection and fires. The use of artillery was not the only thing that resembled World War II-style employment of military force. The deep battle doctrine still haunts Russia in the way it's deployed its tanks as well. Often these armored units were and are deployed without proper infantry support. The most famous example came in the Battle of Kiev at the start of the war, where unsupported Russian tanks proved easy pickings for the elite Ukrainian infantry units armed with javelins and NLAWs. Drones have also had their way with these units. In the Battle of Kiev, stalled tank convoys were vulnerable to high-flying Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones, armed with air-to-surface missiles. Later, even cheaper first-person view FPV drones, armed with anti-tank grenades, inflicted high casualties on unsupported tank units. In Ukraine, Russian units have often moved into heavily fortified areas without support from other types of arms. Wave upon wave of Russian tanks tried dislodging entrenched Ukrainian defenders armed with tank-killing weapons to predictable results. After the failure in Kiev, Russian units managed to grind their way forward in Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts in the summer of 2022, but their tactics changed little. To make matters worse for Russia, much of the fighting in Ukraine has involved urban battlefields, which make unsupported tanks particularly vulnerable to ambushes. Russia under Putin in fact had experience on such urban battlefields during the Chechen wars of the 1990s and early 2000s, where Russian T-72 and T-80 tanks were often decimated by Chechen rebels armed with man-portable anti-tank weapons like RPGs. The Russian armored casualties were so great that Moscow was hesitant to deploy its supposedly latest and greatest tank, the T-90, into that conflict. Similarly, the Kremlin has refused to deploy the T-14 Armata onto the battlefields of Ukraine for fear of losing the few such tanks that it has, even though the Armata should theoretically do better because it's better protected from the jack-in-the-box explosions seen so often in its earlier tank types. Unlike the United States and its allies, who absorbed the lessons of urban combat in Iraq, Russia seemed to learn nothing from its miserable experience in Chechnya and made no modifications to its military doctrine before the start of the invasion of Ukraine. Again, tanks move forward without proper infantry support into urban environments. In such a setting, Russia has been left with little choice but to resort to the same tactics it used in the Chechen wars, most notably seen at Grozny. Reduce these population centers to rubble with all the defenders inside, heedless of civilian casualties. There is another problem with Russia's deep battle doctrine. Much of it is based on the massed tank versus tank battles, for which the T-72 and its successors, the T-80 and T-90, were designed. But classical tank battles have proven rare in Ukraine. Instead, tank combat is far more based on a first-look, first-kill dynamic. Drones or other assets spot tanks from far away. From there, the tank's coordinates are sent to artillery crews, or kamikaze drones are unleashed on them. The tanks are then destroyed long before they get into range to engage in combat with enemy tank formations. Soviet and Russian deep battle doctrine envisioned mass tank engagements, and military engineers designed the T-72 for this purpose. Because the T-72 was cheap, it could easily replace its losses. As we've pointed out, deep battle doctrine emphasized continuous operations that would not stop after the first breakthrough. Deep battle called for consecutive operations to fully penetrate and destroy an enemy army. Gone were the days where one could effectively destroy an enemy's army in a single engagement, such as that seen in the Battle of Guatemala under Alexander the Great. Because modern armies had hundreds of thousands or millions of men over thousands of miles of front, successive engagements would be needed to destroy their ability to present effective armed resistance. The Russian T-72 was made to deploy with such a doctrine in mind. However, warfare has gotten smaller in some ways since the days of the Second World War. In Ukraine, engagements have been fought not at the level of the corps or division that the deep battle doctrine envisioned and for which the T-72 tank and its offshoots were designed. Instead, engagements have usually come on the much smaller scale of the company or platoon level. Such small-scale engagements have meant that Russian tanks are fighting a type of war they were not designed to fight, without the numbers they need to turn the tide against well-armed Ukrainian resistance. The lack of proper air support has been another major vulnerability in the way Russia has deployed its tanks. In a theme echoing its treatment of the T-14, Russia has famously refused to deploy its supposed best fighter jet, the fifth-generation Su-57 Felon, over the skies of Ukraine. Russia has also not used its Air Force in a systematic way since the start of the invasion. It has not established air superiority or provided the type of close air support that the combined arms doctrine would call for, especially during the first year of the war. The modern air defense systems the Ukrainians have put in place to guard their most heavily fortified positions have made the Kremlin leery about using its air force in an offensive capacity. Russia was keener to deploy its air units, especially its helicopters, in the Zaporizhzhia campaign of 2023, but this was when Russia was on the defensive and its air fleet was not under as heavy a threat as it would be if it were attacking fixed Ukrainian positions in offensive operations. Aside from the doctrinal problems Russia has encountered with the use of its tanks, there are also practical reasons for Russia's inability to properly support its tanks with infantry. Russia is in a demographic decline. Unlike in the days of the Soviet Union, it no longer has an overwhelming manpower advantage compared to its enemies. Although Russia outnumbers Ukraine, the latter is in a far better position than Nazi Germany was, or even NATO was in the Cold War. Nazi Germany's population in 1938 was about 70 million people, with about 12 million men in military service by 1944. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had 195 million people, with 52.3 million men between the ages of 16 and 59. The Red Army had about 34 million men in service starting in 1941, giving the Soviet Union a manpower advantage of nearly 3-to-1 at a time when Nazi Germany's ranks were at their high point in 1944. Through much of the war, the manpower advantage was closer to 4-to-1 in the Soviets' favor. These numbers allowed for the deep battle doctrine to work during the Second World War, despite all its flaws. Today, Russia's population is about 147 million to Ukraine's population of about 33.2 million. The estimated military personnel between the two countries as of 2023 is 1.33 million to 500,000, giving Russia a manpower advantage of 2.6-to-1. In practice, the number will be less than that because Russia cannot deploy all of its armed forces to Ukraine. It needs some troops to guard its vast land borders in the Far East and elsewhere. The lack of overwhelming manpower advantage has meant that Russia's traditional style of fighting hasn't served it as well in Ukraine as it did during the Second World War. Namely, the lack of manpower advantage meant that Russia had comparatively little infantry on hand to protect its tanks, particularly during the early months of the war. The disadvantage was most pronounced in urban terrain. There, Ukrainian troops armed with advanced Western weapons like the Javelin could lay easy ambushes and destroy Russia's armored columns. The technological edge allowed for Ukraine to make up for being outnumbered, and Russia did not outnumber Ukraine by enough to compensate. Russian logistics have also proven inadequate to support the type of warfare that its traditional military doctrine calls for. Out of visually confirmed cases, 1,282 Russian tanks have been lost due to capture or abandonment. To keep tanks moving, it's necessary to keep them fueled and repaired, as they will inevitably break down under battlefield conditions. It's also necessary to have armored recovery vehicles to assist them should they malfunction or get bogged down in mud. Russia has lacked in all of these areas, which has prevented its armored columns from maintaining the momentum needed to keep an offensive going on the type of broad scale that its traditional military doctrine calls for. Meanwhile, from the start of the war, the Ukrainian military has used its tanks in a way much more similar to how they were successfully employed to break the stalemate of trench warfare in 1918. Although traditional close air support has been lacking, Ukraine has used its armor in conjunction with infantry and artillery, absorbing important lessons from the Western military training it got before and during the war. Ukraine has also, until recently, proven superior in deploying its drones to spot targets of opportunity and then exploit openings with infantry and armored forces working in concert. In short, tanks are not obsolete. Ukraine demonstrated this fact when it used its armored forces to help regain thousands of square kilometers of territory in the summer and fall of 2022. Although much less successful in 2023, Ukraine's Western tanks, such as the German Leopard, helped its armed forces to break through the first two of Russia's defensive lines in the Zaporizhia Oblast, which are the most sophisticated fortifications built in Europe since World War I. Ukraine proved unable to translate these achievements into wider breakthroughs, but it did show the continued usefulness of tanks in tasks such as storming fortified positions. The usefulness of tanks is now, as always, dependent on how they are deployed on the battlefield. Since ancient times, astute generals have understood that one type of arm is vulnerable if it's not supported by other arms. Infantry can be slow to move. Cavalry or armor is vulnerable if the momentum is halted. Artillery is practically defenseless without other units to protect it. Air support is vulnerable if there are no ground forces to protect it from anti-air fire, and so on. Russia's bitter experiences in Chechnya should have proven this point to the Kremlin's military brass. However, the ghost of the Red Army and its learning some of the wrong lessons from World War II still seems to haunt Russia's military today. If Russia has adapted in some ways since the disasters of 2022, it has done so because it learned them the hard way, through terrible losses on the battlefield. And if the recent fighting around Avdiivka is anything to go by, Russia is still very much enthralled to the ideas that have caused it to use its tanks improperly in offensive operations. But what do you think about Russia's tank doctrine and how it's deployed its armored forces in Ukraine? Is there anything it can do to improve its situation and reduce its armored casualties? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to support the channel and to get more military analysis from military experts.